Chapter 18 of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The London Lawyer's Story. I, who am given to novel reading, how often have I gone out with the doctor when the stranger has summoned him to visit the unknown patient in the lonely house. This strange adventure may lead, in a later chapter, to the revealing of a mysterious crime. The Londoner. "I think," said Mr. Trigg, "that it was on the 15th or 16th of June, 1925, that a lady called to ask almost exactly the same question that you have done, only that she represented herself as inquiring on behalf of a friend whose name she did not mention. Yes, I think I can describe her pretty well. She was tall and handsome, with a very clear skin, dark hair and blue eyes, an attractive girl. I remember that she had very fine brows, rather straight, and not much colour in her face, and she was dressed in something summery but very neat. I should think it would be called an embroidered linen dress. I am not an expert on those things. And a shady white hat of Panama straw." "Your recollections seem very clear," said Parker. "It is. I have rather a good memory. Besides, I saw her on other occasions, as you shall hear. At this first visit, she told me much as you did, that she was only temporarily in town, and had been casually recommended to me. I told her that I should not like to answer her question off-hand. The Act, you may remember, had only recently passed its final reading, and I was by no means up in it. Besides, from just skimming through it, I had convinced myself that various important questions were bound to crop up. I told the lady, Miss Grant was the name she gave, by the way, that I should like to take counsel's opinion before giving her any advice, and asked if she could call again the following day. She said she could, rose and thanked me, offering me her hand. In taking it, I happened to notice rather an odd scar running across the backs of all the fingers, rather as though a chisel or something had slipped at some time. I noticed it quite idly, of course, but it was lucky for me I did. Miss Grant duly turned up the next day. I had looked up a very learned friend in the interval, and gave her the same opinion that I gave you just now. She looked rather concerned about it, in fact, almost more annoyed than concerned. "It seems rather unfair," she said, "that people's money should go away to the Crown like that. After all, a great-niece is a quite near relation, really." I replied that, provided the great-niece could call witnesses to prove that the deceased had always had the intention of leaving her the money, the Crown would, in all probability, allot the estate, or a suitable proportion of it, in accordance with the wishes of the deceased. It would, however, lie entirely within the discretion of the court to do so or not, and, of course, if there had been any quarrel or dispute about the matter at any time, the judge might take an unfavourable view of the great-niece's application. In any case, I added, I don't know that the great-niece is excluded under the Act. I only understand that she may be. In any case, there are still 6 months before the Act comes into force, and many things may happen before that." "You mean that Auntie may die," she said. "But she's not really dangerously ill, only mental, as nurse calls it." Anyhow, she went away then, after paying my fee, and I noticed that the friend's great-aunt had suddenly become Auntie, and decided that my client felt a certain personal interest in the matter. "I fancy she had," said Parker. "When did you see her again?" "Oddly enough, I ran across her in the following December. I was having a quick and early dinner in Soho before going on to a show. The little place I usually patronize was very full, and I had to sit at a table where a woman was already seated. As I muttered the usual formula about was anybody sitting there, she looked up, and I promptly recognized my client. "Why, how do you do, Miss Grant?" I said. "I beg your pardon," she replied rather stiffly. "I think you are mistaken." "I beg your pardon," said I, stiffer still. "My name is Trigg, and you came to consult me in Bedford Row last June. But if I am intruding, I apologize and withdraw." She smiled then and said, "I'm sorry I did not recognize you for the moment." I obtained permission to sit at her table. By way of starting a conversation, I asked whether she had taken any further advice in the matter of the inheritance. She said no, she had been quite content with what I had told her. Still, to make conversation, I inquired whether the great-aunt had made a will after all. She replied, rather briefly, that it had not been necessary. The old lady had died. I noticed that she was dressed in black, and was confirmed in my opinion that she herself was the grandniece concerned. We talked for some time, Inspector, and I will not conceal from you that I found Miss Grant a very interesting personality. She had an almost masculine understanding. I may say I am not the sort of a man who prefers women to be brainless. No, I am rather a modern type in that respect. If ever I was to take a wife, Inspector, I should wish her to be an intelligent companion." Parker said Mr. Trigg's attitude did him great credit. He also made the mental observation that Mr. Trigg would probably not object to marrying a young woman who had inherited money and was unencumbered with relations. "It is rare," went on Mr. Trigg, "to find a woman with a legal mind. Miss Grant was unusual in that respect. She took a great interest in some case or other that was prominent in the newspapers at the time, I forget now what it was, and asked me some remarkably sensible and intelligent questions. I must say that I quite enjoyed our conversation. Before dinner was over, we had got on to more personal topics, in the course of which I happened to mention that I lived in Golders Green." "Did she give you her own address?" "She said she was staying at the Peveril Hotel in Bloomsbury, and that she was looking for a house in town. I said that I might possibly hear of something out Hampstead way, and offered my professional services in case she should require them. After dinner I accompanied her back to the hotel and bade her good-bye in the lounge." "She was really staying there, then?" "Apparently. However, about a fortnight later I happened to hear of a house in Golders Green that had fallen vacant suddenly. It belonged, as a matter of fact, to a client of mine. In pursuance of my promise, I wrote to Miss Grant at the Peveril. Receiving no reply, I made inquiries there, and found that she had left the hotel the day after our meeting, leaving no address. In the hotel register she had merely given her address as Manchester. I was somewhat disappointed, but thought no more about the matter. About a month later, on January 26th to be exact, I was sitting at home reading a book, preparatory to retiring to bed. I should say I occupy a flat, or rather maisonette, in a small house which has been divided to make two establishments. The people on the ground floor were away at that time, so that I was quite alone in the house. My housekeeper only comes in by the day. The telephone rang. I noticed the time. It was 11:15. I answered it, and a woman's voice spoke, begged me to come instantly to a certain house on Hampstead Heath to make a will for some one who was at the point of death. Did you recognize the voice? No, it sounded like a servant's voice. At any rate, it had a strong Cockney accent. I asked whether tomorrow would not be time enough, but the voice urged me to hurry, or it might be too late. Rather annoyed, I put my things on and went out. It was a most unpleasant night, cold and foggy. I was lucky enough to find a taxi on the nearest rank. We drove to the address, which we had great difficulty in finding, as everything was pitch black. It turned out to be a small house in a very isolated position on the heath. In fact, there was no proper approach to it. I left the taxi on the road, about a couple of 100 yards off, and asked the man to wait for me, as I was very doubtful of ever finding another taxi in that spot at that time of night. He grumbled a good deal, but consented to wait if I promised not to be very long. I made my way to the house. At first I thought it was quite dark, but presently I saw a faint glimmer in a ground room. I rang the bell. No answer, though I could hear it trilling loudly. I rang again and knocked. Still no answer. It was bitterly cold. I struck a match to be sure I had come to the right house, and then I noticed that the front door was ajar. I thought that perhaps the servant who had called me was so much occupied with her sick mistress as to be able to leave her to come to the door. Thinking that in any case I might be of assistance to her, I pushed the door open and went in. The hall was perfectly dark, and I bumped against an umbrella stand in entering. I thought I heard a faint voice, calling or moaning, and when my eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, I stumbled forward and saw a dim light coming from a door on the left. Was that the room which you had seen illuminated from outside? I think so. I called out, "May I come in?" And a very low, weak voice replied, "Yes, please." I pushed the door open and entered a room furnished as a sitting-room. In one corner there was a couch, on which some bedclothes appeared to have been hurriedly thrown to enable it to be used as a bed. On the couch lay a woman, all alone. I could only dimly make her out. There was no light in the room except a small oil lamp with a green shade, so tilted as to keep the light from the sick woman's eyes. There was a fire in the grate, but it had burnt low. I could see, however, that the woman's head and face were swathed in white bandages. I put out my hand and felt for the electric switch, but she called out, "No light, please. It hurts me." "How did she see you put your hand to the switch?" "Well," said Mr. Trigg, "that was an odd thing. She didn't speak, as a matter of fact, till I had actually clicked the switch down. But nothing happened. The light didn't come on." "Really?" "No. I suppose that the bulb had been taken away, or had gone foot. However, I said nothing, and came up to the bed. She said, in a sort of half-whisper, 'Is that the lawyer?' I said yes, and asked what I could do for her. She said, 'I've had a terrible accident. I can't live. I want to make my will quickly.' I asked whether there was nobody with her. 'Yes, yes,' she said in a hurried way. 'My servant will be back in a moment. She has gone to look for a doctor.' 'But,' I said, 'couldn't she have rung up? You are not fit to be left alone.' 'We couldn't get through to one,' she replied. 'It's all right. She will be here soon. Don't waste time. I must make my will.' She spoke in a dreadful, gasping way, and I felt that the best thing would be to do what she wanted, for fear of agitating her. I drew a chair to the table where the lamp was, got out my fountain pen and a printed will form with which I had provided myself, and expressed myself ready to receive her instructions. Before beginning, she asked me to give her a little brandy and water from a decanter which stood on the table. I did so, and she took a small sip, which seemed to revive her. I placed the glass near her hand, and at her suggestion mixed another glass for myself. I was very glad of it, for, as I said, it was a beast of a night, and the room was cold. I looked round for some extra coals to put on the fire, but could see none. "That," said Parker, "is extremely interesting and suggestive." I thought it queer at the time, but the whole thing was queer. Anyway, I then said I was ready to begin. She said, "You may think I am a little mad, because my head has been so hurt. But I am quite sane. But he shan't have a penny of the money." I asked her if someone had attacked her. She replied, "My husband. He thinks he has killed me. But I am going to live long enough to will the money away." She then said that her name was Mrs. Marion Mead, and proceeded to make a will, leaving her estate, which amounted to about £10,000, among various legatees, including a daughter and 3 or 4 sisters. It was rather a complicated will, as it included various devices for tying up the daughter's money in a trust, so as to prevent her from ever handing over any of it to the father. Did you make a note of the names and addresses of the people involved? I did, but as you will see later on, I could make no use of them. The testatrix was certainly clear-headed enough about the provisions of the will, though she seemed terribly weak, and her voice never rose above a whisper, after that one time when she had called to me not to turn on the light. At length I finished my notes of the will, and started to draft it out on the proper form. There were no signs of the servant's return, and I began to become really anxious. Also the extreme cold, or something else, added to the fact that it was now long past my bedtime, was making me appallingly sleepy. I poured out another stiff little dose of the brandy to warm me up, and went on writing out the will. When I had finished, I said, "How about signing this? We need another witness to make it legal." She said, "My servant must be here in a minute or two. I can't think what has happened to her." "I expect she has missed her way in the fog," I said. "However, I will wait a little longer. I can't go and leave you like this." She thanked me feebly, and we sat for some time in silence. As time went on, I began to feel the situation to be increasingly uncanny. The sick woman breathed heavily and moaned from time to time. The desire for sleep overpowered me more and more. I could not understand it. Presently it occurred to me, stupefied though I felt, that the most sensible thing would be to get the taxi-man, if he was still there, to come in and witness the will with me, and then to go myself to find a doctor. I sat, sleepily revolving this in my mind, and trying to summon energy to speak. I felt as though a great weight of inertia was pressing down upon me. Exertion of any kind seemed almost beyond my powers. Suddenly something happened which brought me back to myself. Mrs. Mead turned a little over upon the couch, and peered at me intently, as it seemed, in the lamplight. To support herself, she put both her hands on the edge of the table. I noticed, with a vague sense of something unexpected, that the left hand bore no wedding ring. And then I noticed something else. Across the back of the fingers of the right hand went a curious scar, as though a chisel or some such thing had slipped and cut them. Parker sat upright in his chair. "Yes," said Mr. Trigg, "that interests you. It startled me. Or rather, startled isn't quite the word. In my oppressed state, it affected me like some kind of nightmare. I struggled upright in my chair, and the woman sank back upon her pillows. At that moment there came a violent ring at the bell. The servant? No, thank heaven, it was my taxi driver, who had become tired of waiting. I don't quite know what I thought, but I was alarmed. I gave some kind of shout or groan, and the man came straight in. Happily, I had left the door open, as I had found it. I pulled myself together sufficiently to ask him to witness the will. I must have looked queer and spoken in a strange way, for I remember how he looked from me to the brandy bottle. However, he signed the paper after Mrs. Mead, who wrote her name in a weak, straggling hand as she lay on her back. "What next, Governor?" asked the man when this was done. I was feeling dreadfully ill by now. I could only say, "Take me home." He looked at Mrs. Mead and then at me and said, "Ain't there nobody else to see to the lady, sir?" I said, "Fetch a doctor, but take me home first." I stumbled out of the house on his arm. I heard him muttering something about its being a rum start. I don't remember the drive home. When I came back to life, I was in my own bed, and one of the local doctors was standing over me. I'm afraid this story is getting very long and tedious. To cut matters short, it seems the taxi driver, who was a very decent, intelligent fellow, had found me completely insensible at the end of the drive. He didn't know who I was, but he hunted in my pocket and found my visiting card and my latchkey. He took me home, got me upstairs, and, deciding that if I was drunk I was a worse drunk than he had ever encountered in his experience, humanely went round and fetched a doctor. The doctor's opinion was that I had been heavily drugged, with veronal or something of that kind. Fortunately, if the idea was to murder me, the dose had been very much underestimated. We went into the matter thoroughly, and the upshot was that I must have taken about 30 grains of the stuff. It appears that it is a difficult drug to trace by analysis, but that was the conclusion the doctor came to, looking at the matter all round. Undoubtedly the brandy had been doped. Of course, we went round to look at the house next day. It was all shut up, and the local milkman informed us that the occupiers had been away for a week and were not expected home for another 10 days. We got into communication with them, but they appeared to be perfectly genuine, ordinary people, and they declared they knew nothing whatever about it. They were accustomed to go away every so often, just shutting the house and not bothering about a caretaker or anything. The man came along at once, naturally, to investigate matters, but couldn't find that anything had been stolen or disturbed, except that a pair of sheets and some pillows showed signs of use, and a scuttle of coal had been used in the sitting-room. The coal cellar, which also contained the electric meter, had been left locked, and the meter turned off before the family left. They apparently had a few grains of sense, which accounts for the chilly darkness of the house when I entered it. The visitor had apparently slipped back the catch of the pantry window, one of the usual gimcrack affairs, with a knife or something, and had brought her own lamp, siphon, and brandy. Daring, but not really difficult. No Mrs. Mead or Miss Grant was to be heard of anywhere, as I needn't tell you. The tenants of the house were not keen to start expensive inquiries. After all, they'd lost nothing but a shilling's worth of coals, and, on consideration, and seeing that I hadn't actually been murdered or anything, I thought it best to let the matter slide. It was a most unpleasant adventure." "I'm sure it was. Did you ever hear from Miss Grant again?" "Why, yes. She rang me up twice. Once after 3 months, and again only a fortnight ago, asking for an appointment. You may think me cowardly, Mr. Parker, but each time I put her off. I didn't quite know what might happen. As a matter of fact, the opinion I formed in my own mind was that I had been entrapped into that house with the idea of making me spend the night there, and afterwards blackmailing me. That was the only explanation I could think of which would account for the sleeping draught. I thought discretion was the better part of valour, and gave my clerks and my housekeeper instructions that if Miss Grant should call at any time, I was out and not expected back." "Do you suppose she knew you had recognized the scar on her hand?" "I'm sure she didn't. Otherwise she would hardly have made advances to meet me in her own name again." "No, I think you are right. Well, Mr. Trigg, I am much obliged to you for this information, which may turn out to be very valuable. And if Miss Grant should ring you up again— Where did she call from, by the way?" "From call boxes each time. I know that because the operator always tells one when the call is from a public box. I didn't have the calls traced." "No, of course not. Well, if she does it again, will you please make an appointment with her, and then let me know about it at once? A call to Scotland Yard will always find me." Mr. Trigg promised that he would do this, and Parker took his leave. "And now we know," thought Parker as he returned home, "that somebody, an odd, unscrupulous somebody, was making inquiries about great nieces in 1925. A word to Miss Climpson, I fancy, is indicated, just to find out whether Mary Whittaker has a scar on her right hand, or whether I've got to hunt up any more solicitors." The hot streets seemed less oppressively oven-like than before. In fact, Parker was so cheered by his interview that he actually bestowed a cigarette card upon the next urchin who accosted him. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. The Medico-Legal Problem. There's not a crime but takes its proper change out, still in crime, if once rung on the counter of this world. E. B. Browning, Aurora Leigh. Chapter 19. Gone Away. There is nothing good or evil save in the will. Epictetus. "You will not, I imagine, deny," observed Lord Peter, "that very odd things seem to happen to the people who are in a position to give information about the last days of Agatha Dawson. Bertha Gotobed dies suddenly under suspicious circumstances. Her sister thinks she sees Miss Whittaker lying in wait for her at Liverpool docks. Mr. Trigg is inveigled into a house of mystery and is semi-poisoned. I wonder what would have happened to Mr. Probyn if he had been careless enough to remain in England." "I deny nothing," replied Parker. "I will only point out to you that during the month in which these disasters occurred to the Gotobed family, The object of your suspicions was in Kent, with Miss Vera Findlater, who never left her side." "As against that undoubted snag," rejoined Wimsey, "I bring forward a letter from Miss Climpson, in which, amid a lot of rigmarole with which I will not trouble you, she informs me that upon Miss Whittaker's right hand there is a scar precisely similar to the one which Mr. Trigg describes." "Is there?" "That does seem to connect Miss Whittaker pretty definitely to the Trigg business. But is it your theory that she is trying to polish off all the people who know anything about Miss Dawson? Rather big job, don't you think, for a single-handed female? And if so, why is Dr. Carr spared? And Nurse Philliter, and Nurse Forbes, and the other Dr. Jappy, and the rest of the population of Leahampton, if it comes to that?" "That's an interesting point, which had already occurred to me. I think I know why. Up to the present, the Dawson case has presented two different problems, one legal and one medical. The motive and the means, if you like that better. As far as opportunity goes, only two people figure as possibles: Miss Whittaker and Nurse Forbes. The Forbes woman had nothing to gain by killing a good patient, so for the moment we can wash her out. Well, now, as to the medical problem, the means, I must say that up to now that appears completely insoluble. I am baffled, Watson," said he, his hawk-like eyes gleaming angrily from under the half-closed lids. "Even I am baffled. But not for long," he cried, with a magnificent burst of self-confidence. "My honour, H, is concerned in tracking this human fiend, capitals, to its hidden source, and nail the whited sepulchre to the mast, even though it crush me in the attempt." Loud applause. His chin sank broodingly upon his dressing-gown, and he breathed a few guttural notes into a bass saxophone, which was the cherished companion of his solitary hours in the bathroom. Parker ostentatiously took up the book which he had laid aside on Wimsey's entrance. "Tell me when you've finished," he said caustically. "I've hardly begun. The means, I repeat, seems insoluble, and so the criminal evidently thinks. There has been no exaggerated mortality among the doctors and nurses. On that side of the business the lady feels herself safe. No, the motive is the weak point. Hence the hurry to stop the mouths of the people who knew about the legal part of the problem." "Yes, I see. Mrs. Cropper has started back to Canada, by the way. She doesn't seem to have been molested at all." "No, and that's why I still think there was somebody on the watch at Liverpool. Mrs. Cropper was only worth silencing so long as she had told nobody her story. That is why I was careful to meet her and accompany her ostentatiously to town." "Oh, rot, Peter! Even if Miss Whittaker had been there, which we know she couldn't have been, how was she to know that you were going to ask about Dawson and that business? She doesn't know you from Adam." "She might have found out who Murbles was. The advertisement which started the whole business was in his name, you know. In that case, why hasn't she attacked Murbles, or you?" "Murbles is a wise old bird. In vain are nets spread in his sight. He is seeing no female clients, answering no invitations, and never goes out without an escort." "I didn't know he took it so seriously." "Oh, yes. Murbles is old enough to have learnt the value of his own skin. As for me, have you noticed the remarkable similarity, in some ways, between Mr. Trigg's adventure and my own little adventurelet, as you might say, in South Audley Street? What, with Mrs. Forrest? Yes, the secret appointment, the drink, the endeavour to get one to stay the night at all costs. I'm positive there was something in that sugar, Charles, that no sugar should contain. See Public Health, Adulteration of Foods, Act, various. You think Mrs. Forrest is an accomplice? I do. I don't know what she has to gain by it, probably money, but I feel sure there is some connection, partly because of Bertha Gotobed's £5 note, partly because Mrs. Forrest's story was a palpable fake. I'm certain the woman never had a lover, let alone a husband. You can't mistake real inexperience. And chiefly because of the similarity of method. Criminals always tend to repeat their effects. Look at George Joseph Smith and his brides. Look at Neil Cream. Look at Armstrong and his tea parties. Well, if there's an accomplice, all the better. Accomplices generally end up by giving the show away. True, and we are in a good position because, up till now, I don't think they know that we suspect any connection between them. But I still think, we ought to get some evidence that actual crimes have been committed. Call me finicking if you like. If you could suggest a means of doing away with these people so as to leave no trace, I should feel happier about it. The means, eh? Well, we do know something about it. As what? Well, take the 2 victims. Alleged. All right, old particular. The 2 alleged victims, and the 2 alleged intended victims. Miss Dawson was ill and helpless. Bertha Gotobed possibly stupefied by a heavy meal and an unaccustomed quantity of wine. Trigg was given a sufficient dose of veronal to send him to sleep, and I was offered something of probably the same kind. I wish I could have kept the remains of that coffee. So we deduce from that what? I suppose that it was a means of death which could only be used on somebody more or less helpless or unconscious. Exactly. As, for instance, a hypodermic injection. Only nothing appears to have been injected. Or a delicate operation of some kind, if we could only think of one to fit the case. Or the inhalation of something, such as chloroform, only we could find no traces of suffocation. Yes, that doesn't get us very far, though. It's something. Then again, it may well be something that a trained nurse would have learnt or heard about. Miss Whittaker was trained, which, by the way, was what made it so easy for her to bandage up her own head and provide a pitiful and unrecognizable spectacle for the stupid Mr. Trigg. It wouldn't have to be anything very out of the ordinary. Nothing, I mean, that only a trained surgeon could do, or that required very specialized knowledge. Oh, no, probably something picked up in conversation with a doctor or the other nurses. I say, how about getting hold of Dr. Carr again? Or, no, if he'd got any ideas on the subject, he'd have trotted 'em out before. I know, I'll ask Lubbock, the analyst. He'll do. I'll get in touch with him tomorrow. And meanwhile, said Parker, I suppose we just sit round and wait for somebody else to be murdered. It's beastly, isn't it? I still feel poor Bertha Gotobed's blood on my head, so to speak. I say, yes, we've practically got clear proof on the Trigg business. Couldn't you put the lady in quod on a charge of burglary, while we think out the rest of the dope? It's often done. It was a burglary, you know. She broke into a house after dark and appropriated a scuttleful of coal to her own use. Trigg could identify her. He seems to have paid the lady particular attention on more than one occasion. And we could rake up his taxi-man for corroborative detail." Parker pulled at his pipe for a few minutes. "There's something in that," he said finally. "I think perhaps it's worth while putting it before the authorities. But we mustn't be in too much of a hurry. You know, I wish we were further ahead with our other proofs. There is such a thing as habeas corpus. You can't hold on to people indefinitely, just on a charge of stealing coal. There's the breaking and entering, don't forget that. It's burglary, after all. You can get penal servitude for life for burglary. But it all depends on the view the law takes of the coal. It might decide that there was no original intention of stealing coal, and treat the thing as a mere misdemeanor, or civil trespass. Anyhow, we really don't want a conviction for stealing coal. But I'll see what they think about it at our place. And meanwhile, I'll get hold of Trigg again, and try and find the taxi driver. And Trigg's doctor. We might get it as an attempt to murder Trigg, or at least to inflict grievous bodily harm. But I should like some more evidence about... Cuckoo! So should I. But I can't manufacture evidence out of nothing. Dash it all, be reasonable. I've built you up a case out of nothing. Isn't that handsome enough? Base ingratitude, that's what's the matter with you." Parker's inquiries took some time, and June lingered into its longest days. Chamberlain and Levine flew the Atlantic, and Seagrave bade farewell to Brooklands. The Daily Yell wrote anti-red leaders and discovered a plot. Somebody laid claim to a marquisate, and a Czechoslovakian pretended to swim the Channel. Hammond outgraced Grace. There was an outburst of murder at Moscow. Foxlaw won the Gold Cup, and the earth opened at Oxhay and swallowed up somebody's front garden. Oxford decided that women were dangerous, and the electric hare consented to run at the White City. England's supremacy was challenged at Wimbledon, and the House of Lords made the gesture of stooping to conquer. Meanwhile, Lord Peter's projected magnum opus, on 101 Ways of Causing Sudden Death, had advanced by the accumulation of a mass of notes which flowed all over the library at the flat, and threatened to engulf Bunter, whose task it was to file and cross-reference, and generally to produce order from chaos. Oriental scholars and explorers were buttonholed in clubs and strenuously pumped on the subject of abstruse native poisons. Horrid experiments performed in German laboratories were communicated in unreadable documents. And the life of Sir James Lubbock, who had the misfortune to be a particular friend of Lord Peter's, was made a burden to him, with daily inquiries as to the post-mortem detection of such varying substances as chloroform, curare, hydrosanic acid gas, and diethylsulfonmethylethylaminate. "But surely there must be something which kills without leaving a trace," pleaded Lord Peter, when at length informed that the persecution must cease. "A thing in such universal demand, surely it is not beyond the wit of scientists to invent it. It must exist. Why isn't it properly advertised? There ought to be a company to exploit it. It is simply ridiculous. Why, it's a thing one might want oneself any day." "You don't understand," said Sir James Lubbock. "Plenty of poisons leave no particular post-mortem appearances. And plenty of them, especially the vegetable ones, are difficult to find by analysis unless you know what you are looking for. For instance, if you are testing for arsenic, that test won't tell you whether strychnine is present or not. And if you're testing for strychnine, you won't find morphia. You've got to try one test after another till you hit the right one. And, of course, there are certain poisons for which no recognized tests exist." "I know all that," said Wimsey. "I've tested things myself. But these poisons with no recognized test, how do you set about proving that they're there?" "Well, of course, you would take the symptoms into account, and so on. You would look at the history of the case." "Yes, but I want a poison that doesn't produce any symptoms. Except death, of course, if you call that a symptom. Isn't there a poison with no symptoms and no test? Something that just makes you go off, poof, like that?" "Certainly not," said the analyst, rather annoyed, for your medical analyst lives by symptoms and tests, and nobody likes suggestions that undermine the very foundations of his profession. "Not even old age or mental decay. There are always symptoms." Fortunately, before symptoms of mental decay could become too pronounced in Lord Peter, Parker sounded the call to action. "I'm going down to Leahampton with a warrant," he said. "I may not use it, but the chief thinks it might be worth while to make an inquiry. What with the Battersea mystery and the Daniels business and Bertha Gotobed, there seems to be a feeling that there have been too many unexplained tragedies this year, and the press have begun yelping again, blast them. There's an article in John's Citizen this week with a poster, 96 murderers at large. And the Evening Views is starting its reports with 6 weeks have now passed, and the police are no nearer the solution. You know the thing. We'll simply have to get some sort of move on. Do you want to come?" "Certainly. A breath of country air would do me good, I fancy. Blow away the old cobwebs, don't you know? It might even inspire me to invent a good way of murdering people. Oh, inspiration, solitary child, warbling thy native wood notes wild. Did somebody write that, or did I invent it? Sounds reminiscent, somehow." Parker, who was out of temper, replied rather shortly, and intimated that the police car would be starting for Leahampton in an hour's time. "I will be there," said Wimsey, "though, mind you, I hate being driven by another fellow. It feels so unsafe. Never mind, I will be bloody, bold, and resolute, as Queen Victoria said to the Archbishop of Canterbury." They reached Leahampton without any incident to justify Lord Peter's fears. Parker had brought another officer with him, and on the way they picked up the chief constable of the county, who appeared very dubiously disposed toward their errand. Lord Peter, observing their array of 5 strong men going out to seize upon one young woman, was reminded of the Marquise de Brinvilliers. What, all that water for a little person like me? But this led him back to the subject of poison, and he remained steeped in thought and gloom till the car drew up before the house in Wellington Avenue. Parker got out and went up the path with the chief constable. The door was opened to them by a frightened-looking maid, who gave a little shriek at sight of them. "Oh, sir, have you come to say something's happened to Miss Whittaker?" "Isn't Miss Whittaker at home, then?" "No, sir. She went out in the car with Miss Vera Findlater on Monday. That's 4 days back, sir. She hasn't come home, nor Miss Findlater neither, and I'm frightened something's happened to them. When I see you, sir, I thought you was the police, coming to say there had been an accident. I didn't know what to do, sir." "Skipped, by God," was Parker's instant thought, but he controlled his annoyance, and asked, "Do you know where they were going?" "Crow's Beach, Miss Whittaker said, sir." "That's a good 50 miles," said the chief constable. "Probably they've just decided to stay there a day or two." "More likely gone in the opposite direction," thought Parker. "They didn't take no things for the night, sir. They went off about 10 in the morning. They said they was going to have lunch there and come home in the evening. And Miss Whittaker hasn't written nor nothing, and her always so particular. Cook and me, we didn't know what—" "Oh, well, I expect it's all right," said the chief constable. "It's a pity, as we particularly wanted to see Miss Whittaker. When you hear from her, you might say Sir Charles Pillington called with a friend." "Yes, sir, but please, sir, what ought we to do, sir?" "Nothing. Don't worry. I'll have inquiries made. I'm the chief constable, you know, and I can soon find out whether there's been any accident or anything. But if there had been, depend upon it, we should have heard about it. Come, my girl, pull yourself together. There's nothing to cry about. We'll let you know as soon as we hear anything." But Sir Charles looked disturbed. Coming on top of Parker's arrival in the district, the thing had an unpleasant look about it. Lord Peter received the news cheerfully. "Good," he said. "Joggle 'em up. Keep 'em moving. That's the spirit. Always like it when something happens. My worst suspicions are going to be justified. That always makes one feel so important and virtuous, don't you think? Wonder why she took the girl with her, though. By the way, we'd better look up the Findlaters. They may have heard something." This obvious suggestion was acted upon at once. But at the Findlaters' house they drew blank. The family were at the seaside, with the exception of Miss Vera, who was staying in Wellington Avenue with Miss Whittaker. No anxiety was expressed by the parlour-maid, and none apparently felt. The investigators took care not to arouse any alarm, and, leaving a trivial and polite message from Sir Charles, withdrew for a consultation. "There's nothing for it, so far as I can see," said Parker, "but an all-stations call to look out for the car and the ladies. And we must put inquiries through to all the ports, of course. With 4 days' start, they may be anywhere by now. I wish to heaven I'd risked a bit and started earlier, approval or no approval. What's this Findlater girl like? I'd better go back to the house and get photographs of her and the Whittaker woman. And, Wimsey, I wish you'd look in on Miss Climpson and see if she has any information. And you might tell 'em at the Yard to keep an eye on Mrs. Forrest's place," said Wimsey. "When anything sensational happens to a criminal, it's a good tip to watch the accomplice." "I feel sure you are both quite mistaken about this," urged Sir Charles Pillington. "Criminal accomplice! Bless me! I have had considerable experience in the course of a long life, longer than either of yours, and I really feel convinced that Miss Whittaker, whom I know quite well, is as good and nice a girl as you could wish to find. But there has undoubtedly been an accident of some kind, and it is our duty to make the fullest investigation. I will get on to Crow's Beach Police immediately, as soon as I know the description of the car. It's an Austin 7, and the number is XX9917, said Wimsey, much to the chief constable's surprise. "But I doubt very much whether you'll find it at Crow's Beach or anywhere near it." "Well, we'd better get a move on," snapped Parker. "We'd better separate. How about a spot of lunch in an hour's time at the George?" Wimsey was unlucky. Miss Climpson was not to be found. She had had her lunch early and gone out, saying she felt that a long country walk would do her good. Mrs. Budge was rather afraid she had had some bad news. She had seemed so upset and worried since yesterday evening. "But indeed, sir," she added, "if you was quick you might find her up at the church. She often drops in there to say her prayers like. Not a respectful way to approach a place of worship, to my mind. Do you think so yourself, sir? Popping in and out on a weekday, the same as if it was a friend's house, and coming home from communion as cheerful as anything, and ready to laugh and make jokes. I don't see as how you was meant to make an ordinary thing of religion that way. So disrespectful, and nothing uplifting to the art about it. But there, we all has our failings. And Miss Climpson is a nice lady, and that I must say, even if she is a Roman Catholic, or next door to one." Lord Peter thought that Roman Catholic was rather an appropriate name for the more ultramontane section of the High Church party. At the moment, however, he felt he could not afford time for religious discussion, and set off for the church in quest of Miss Climpson. The doors of St. Onesimus were hospitably open, and the red sanctuary lamp made a little spot of welcoming brightness in the rather dark building. Coming in from the June sunshine, Wimsey blinked a little before he could distinguish anything else. Presently he was able to make out a dark bowed figure kneeling before the lamp. For a moment he hoped it was Miss Climpson, but presently saw, to his disappointment, that it was merely a sister in a black habit, presumably taking her turn to watch before the host. The only other occupant of the church was a priest in a cassock, who was busy with the ornaments on the high altar. It was the feast of St. John, Wimsey remembered suddenly. He walked up the aisle, hoping to find his quarry hidden in some obscure corner. His shoes squeaked. This annoyed him. It was a thing which Bunter never permitted. He was seized with a fancy that the squeak was produced by a diabolic possession, a protest against a religious atmosphere on the part of his own particular besetting devil. Pleased with this thought, he moved forward more confidently. The priest's attention was attracted by the squeak. He turned and came towards the intruder. No doubt, thought Wimsey, to offer his professional services to exorcise the evil spirit. "Were you looking for anybody?" inquired the priest courteously. "Well, I was looking for a lady," began Wimsey. Then it struck him that this sounded a little odd under the circumstances, and he hastened to explain more fully in the stifled tones considered appropriate to consecrated surroundings. "Oh, yes," said the priest, quite unperturbed. "Miss Climpson was here a little time ago, but I fancy she has gone. Not that I usually keep tabs on my flock," he added with a laugh, "but she spoke to me before she went. Was it urgent? What a pity you should have missed her. Can I give any kind of message, or help you in any way?" "No, thanks," said Wimsey. "Sorry to bother you. Unseemly to come and try to haul people out of church. But yes, it was rather important. I'll leave a message at the house. Thanks frightfully." He turned away, and then stopped and came back. "I say," he said, "you give advice on moral problems and all that sort of thing, don't you?" "Well, we're supposed to try," said the priest. Is anything bothering you in particular?" "Yes," said Wimsey. "Nothing religious, I don't mean. Nothing about infallibility or the Virgin Mary or anything of that sort. Just something I'm not comfortable about." The priest, who was in fact the vicar, Mr. Treadgold, indicated that he was quite at Lord Peter's service. "It's very good of you. Could we go somewhere where I don't have to whisper so much? I never can explain things in a whisper. Sort of paralyses one, don't you know?" "Let's go outside," said Mr. Treadgold. So they went out and sat on a flat tombstone. "It's like this," said Wimsey. "Hypothetical case, you see, and so on. Supposin' one knows somebody who's very, very ill, and can't last long, and they're in awful pain and all that, and kept under morphia, practically dead to the world, you know. And suppose that by dyin' straight away they could make something happen which they really wanted to happen, and which couldn't happen if they lived on a little longer. I can't explain exactly how, because I don't want to give personal details, and so on. You get the idea? Well, supposin' somebody who knew all that was just to give 'em a little push-off, so to speak, hurry matters on, why should that be a very dreadful crime?" "The law—" began Mr. Treadgold. "Oh, the law says it's a crime fast enough," said Wimsey. "But do you honestly think it's very bad? I know you'd call it a sin, of course, but why is it so very dreadful? It doesn't do the person any harm, does it?" "We can't answer that," said Mr. Treadgold, "without knowing the ways of God with the soul. In those last weeks or hours of pain and unconsciousness, the soul may be undergoing some necessary part of its pilgrimage on earth. It isn't our business to cut it short. Who are we to take life and death into our hands?" "Well, we do it all day, one way and another, juries, soldiers, doctors, all that. And yet I do feel somehow that it isn't a right thing in this case. And yet by interfering, finding things out, and so on, one may do far worse harm, start all kinds of things." "I think," said Mr. Treadgold, "that the sin— I won't use that word— the damage to society, the wrongness of the thing, lies much more in the harm it does the killer than in anything it can do to the person who is killed, especially, of course, if the killing is to the killer's own advantage. The consequence you mention, this thing which the sick person wants done, does the other person stand to benefit by it, may I ask?" "Yes, that's just it. They do." "That puts it at once on a different plane from just hastening a person's death out of pity. Sin is in the intention, not the deed. That is the difference between divine law and human law. It is bad for a human being to get to feel that he has any right whatever to dispose of another person's life to his own advantage. It leads him to think himself above all laws. Society is never safe from the man who has deliberately committed murder with impunity. That is one reason why God forbids private vengeance." "You mean that one murder leads to another?" "Very often. In any case, it leads to a readiness to commit others." "It has. That's the trouble. But it wouldn't have if I hadn't started trying to find things out. Ought I to have left it alone?" "I see. That is very difficult. Terrible, too, for you. You feel responsible." "Yes." "You yourself are not serving a private vengeance?" "Oh, no, nothing really to do with me. Started in like a fool to help somebody who'd got into trouble about the thing through having suspicions himself. And my beastly interference started the crimes all over again. I shouldn't be too troubled. Probably the murderer's own guilty fears would have led him into fresh crimes, even without your interference." "That's true," said Wimsey, remembering Mr. Trigg. "My advice to you is to do what you think is right, according to the laws which we have been brought up to respect. Leave the consequences to God. And try to think charitably even of wicked people. You know what I mean. Bring the offender to justice. But remember that if we all got justice, you and I wouldn't escape either. I know, knock the man down, but don't dance on the body. Quite. Forgive my troubling you, and excuse my barging off, because I've got a date with a friend. Thanks so much. I don't feel quite so rotten about it now. But I was getting worried." Mr. Treadgold watched him as he trotted away between the graves. "Dear, dear," he said, "how nice they are. So kindly and scrupulous, and so vague outside their public school code. And much more nervous and sensitive than people think. A very difficult class to reach. I must make a special intention for him at Mass to-morrow." Being a practical man, Mr. Treadgold made a knot in his handkerchief to remind him of this pious resolve. The problem, to interfere or not to interfere, God's law and Caesar's. Policemen, now, it's no problem to them, but for the ordinary man, how hard to disentangle his own motives. I wonder what brought him here. Could it possibly be? "No," said the vicar, checking himself. "I have no right to speculate." He drew out his handkerchief again, and made another mnemonic knot as a reminder against his next confession that he had fallen into the sin of inquisitiveness. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder. Siegfried. What does this mean? Isbrand. A pretty piece of kidnapping, that's all. Beddoes, Death's Jest Book. Parker, too, had spent a disappointing half-hour. It appeared that Miss Whittaker not only disliked having her photograph taken, but had actually destroyed all the existing portraits she could lay hands on, shortly after Miss Dawson's death. Of course, many of Miss Whittaker's friends might be in possession of one, notably, of course, Miss Findlater. But Parker was not sure that he wanted to start a local hue and cry at the moment. Miss Climpson might be able to get one, of course. He went round to Nelson Avenue. Miss Climpson was out. There had been another gentleman asking for her. Mrs. Budge's eyes were beginning to bulge with curiosity. Evidently she was becoming dubious about Miss Climpson's nephew and his friends. Parker then went to the local photographers. There were 5. From 2 of them he extracted a number of local groups containing unrecognizable portraits of Miss Whittaker at church bazaars and private theatricals. She had never had a studio portrait made in Leahampton. Of Miss Findlater, on the other hand, he got several excellent likenesses. A slight, fair girl with a rather sentimental look, plump and prettyish. All these he dispatched to town, with directions that they should be broadcast to the police, together with a description of the girl's address when last seen. The only really cheerful members of the party at the George were the second policeman, who had been having a pleasant gossip with various garage proprietors and publicans, with a view to picking up information, and the chief constable, who was vindicated and triumphant. He had been telephoning to various country police stations, and had discovered that XX9917 had actually been observed on the previous Monday by an AA scout on the road to Crow's Beach. Having maintained all along that the Crow's Beach excursion was a genuine one, he was inclined to exult over the Scotland Yard man. Wimsey and Parker dispiritedly agreed that they had better go down and make inquiries at Crow's Beach. Meanwhile, one of the photographers, whose cousin was on the staff of the Leahampton Mercury, had put a call through to the office of that up-to-date paper, which was just going to press. A stop press announcement was followed by a special edition. Somebody rang up the London Evening Views, which burst out into a front-page scoop. The fat was in the fire, and the Daily Yell, Daily Views, Daily Wire, and Daily Tidings, who were all suffering from lack of excitement, came brightly out next morning with bold headlines about disappearing young women. Crow's Beach, indeed, that pleasant and respectable watering place, knew nothing of Miss Whittaker, Miss Findlater, or car XX9917. No hotel had received them. No garage had refuelled or repaired them. No policeman had observed them. The chief constable held to his theory of an accident, and scouting parties were sent out. Wires arrived at Scotland Yard from all over the place. They had been seen at Dover, at Newcastle, at Sheffield, at Winchester, at Rugby. 2 young women had had tea in a suspicious manner at Folkestone. A car had passed noisily through Dorchester at a late hour on Monday night. A dark-haired girl in an agitated condition had entered a public-house in New Alresford just before closing time and asked the way to Haslemere. Among all these reports, Parker selected that of a Boy Scout, who reported on Saturday morning that he had noticed 2 ladies with a car having a picnic on the Downs on the previous Monday, not far from Shelley Head. The car was an Austin 7. He knew that because he was keen on motors, an unanswerable reason for accuracy in a boy of his age. And he had noticed that it was a London number, though he couldn't say positively what the number was. Shelley Head lies about 10 miles along the coast from Crow's Beach, and is curiously lonely, considering how near it lies to the watering place. Under the cliffs is a long stretch of clear sandy beach, never visited, and overlooked by no houses. The cliffs themselves are chalk, and covered with short turf running back into a wide expanse of downs, covered with gorse and heather. Then comes a belt of pine trees, beyond which is a steep, narrow, and rutty road, leading at length into the tarmac high road between Ramborough and Ryder's Heath. The downs are by no means frequented, though there are plenty of rough tracks which a car can follow if you are not particular about comfort or fussy over your springs. Under the leadership of the Boy Scout, the police car bumped uncomfortably over these disagreeable roads. It was hopeless to look for any previous car tracks, for the chalk was dry and hard, and the grass and heath retained no marks. Everywhere little dells and hollows presented themselves, all exactly alike, and many of them capable of hiding a small car, not to speak of the mere signs and remains of a recent picnic. Having arrived at what their guide thought to be approximately the right place, they pulled up and got out. Parker quartered the ground between the 5 of them, and they set off. Wimsey took a dislike to gorse bushes that day. There were so many of them, and so thick. Any of them might hold a cigarette package, or a sandwich paper, or a scrap of cloth, or a clue of some kind. He trudged along unhappily, back bent and eyes on the ground, over one ridge and down into the hollow, then circling to the right and to the left, taking his bearings by the police car, over the next ridge and down into the next hollow, over the next ridge. Yes, there was something in the hollow. He saw it first sticking out round the edge of a gorse bush. It was light in colour and pointed, rather like a foot. He felt a little sick. "Somebody has gone to sleep there," he said aloud. Then he thought, "Funny, it's always the feet they leave showing." He scrambled down among the bushes, slipping on the short turf and nearly rolling to the bottom. He swore irritably. The person was sleeping oddly. The flies must be a nuisance all over the head like that. It occurred to him that it was rather early in the year for flies. There had been an advertising rhyme in the papers, something about "Each fly you swat now means, remember, 300 fewer next September." Or was it 1,000 fewer? He couldn't get the metre quite right. Then he pulled himself together and went forward. The flies rose up in a little cloud. It must have been a pretty heavy blow, he thought, to smash the back of the skull like that. The shingled hair was blonde. The face lay between the bare arms. He turned the body on its back. Of course, without the photograph, he could not, he need not, be certain that this was Vera Findlater. All this had taken him perhaps 30 seconds. He scrambled up to the rim of the hollow and shouted. A small black figure at some distance stopped and turned. He saw its face as a white spot with no expression on it. He shouted again and waved his arms in wide gestures of explanation. The figure came running. It lurched slowly and awkwardly over the heathy ground. It was the policeman, a heavy man, not built for running in the heat. Wimsey shouted again, and the policeman shouted too. Wimsey saw the others closing in upon him. The grotesque figure of the Boy Scout topped a ridge, waving its staff, then disappeared again. The policeman was quite near now. His bowler hat was thrust back on his head, and there was something on his watch chain that glinted in the sun as he ran. Wimsey found himself running to meet him, and calling, explaining at great length. It was too far off to make himself heard, but he explained, wordily, with emphasis, pointing, indicating. He was quite breathless when the policeman and he came together. They were both breathless. They wagged their heads and gasped. It was ludicrous. He started running again, with the man at his heels. Presently they were all there, pointing, measuring, taking notes, grubbing under the gorse bushes. Wimsey sat down. He was dreadfully tired. "Peter," said Parker's voice, "come and look at this." He got up wearily. There were the remains of a picnic lunch a little farther down the hollow. The policeman had a little bag in his hand. He had taken it from under the body, and was now turning over the trifles it contained. On the ground, close to the dead girl's head, was a thick, heavy spanner, unpleasantly discoloured, and with a few fair hairs sticking to its jaws. But what Parker was calling his attention to was none of these, but a man's mauve-grey cap. "Where did you find that?" asked Wimsey. "Alf here picked it up at the top of the hollow," said Parker. "Tumbled off into the gorse it was," corroborated the scout. "Just up here, lying upside down, just as if it had fallen off somebody's head." "Any footmarks?" "Not likely. But there's a place where the bushes are all trodden and broken. Looks as if there'd been some sort of struggle. What's become of the Austin? Hi, don't touch that spanner, my lad. There may be fingerprints on it. This looks like an attack by some gang or other. Any money in that purse?" 10-shilling note, sixpence, and a few coppers." "Oh, well, the other woman may have had more on her. She's very well off, you know." "Held up for ransom, I shouldn't wonder." Parker bent down and very gingerly enfolded the spanner in a silk handkerchief, carrying it slung by the four corners. "Well, we'd better spread about and have a look for the car. Better try that belt of trees over there. Looks a likely spot. And, Hopkins, I think you'd better run back with our car to Crow's Beach and let 'em know at the station, and come back with a photographer. And take this wire and send it to the Chief Commissioner at Scotland Yard. And find a doctor and bring him along with you. And you'd better hire another car while you're about it, in case we don't find the Austin. We shall be too many to get away in this one. Take Alf back with you if you're not sure of finding the place again. Oh, and Hopkins, fetch us along something to eat and drink, will you? We may be at it a long time. Here's some money. That enough?" "Yes, thank you, sir." The constable went off, taking Alf, who was torn between a desire to stay and do some more detecting, and the pride and glory of being first back with the news. Parker gave a few words of praise for his valuable assistance, which filled him with delight, and then turned to the chief constable. "They obviously went off in this direction. Would you bear away to the left, sir, and enter the trees from that end? And, Peter, will you bear to the right and work through from the other end, while I go straight up the middle?" The chief constable, who seemed a good deal shaken by the discovery of the body, obeyed without a word. Wimsey caught Parker by the arm. "I say," he said, "have you looked at the wound? Something funny, isn't there? There ought to be more mess, somehow. What do you think?" "I'm not thinking anything for the moment," said Parker, a little grimly. "We'll wait for the doctor's report. Come on, Steve. We want to dig out that car. Let's have a look at that cap. Sold by a gentleman resident in Stepney. Almost new. Smells strongly of California poppy. Rather a swell sort of gangsman, apparently. Quite one of the lads of the village." "Yes, we ought to be able to trace that. Thank heavens, they always overlook something. Well, we'd better get along." The search for the car presented no difficulties. Parker stumbled upon it almost as soon as he got in under the trees. There was a clearing, with a little rivulet of water running through it, beside which stood the missing Austin. There were other trees here, mingled with the pines, and the water made an elbow and spread into a shallow pool, with a kind of muddy beach. The hood of the car was up, and Parker approached with an uncomfortable feeling that there might be something disagreeable inside. But it was empty. He tried the gears. They were in neutral, and the handbrake was on. On the seat was a handkerchief, a large linen handkerchief, very grubby and with no initials or laundry mark. Parker grunted a little over the criminal's careless habit of strewing his belongings about. He came round in front of the car and received immediate further proof of carelessness, for on the mud there were footmarks. 2 men's and a woman's, it seemed. The woman had got out of the car first. He could see where the left heel had sunk heavily in as she extricated herself from the low seat. Then the right foot, less heavily. Then she had staggered a little and started to run. But one of the men had been there to catch her. He had stepped out of the bracken in shoes with new rubbers on them, and there were some scuffling marks, as though he had held her and she had tried to break away. Finally, the second man, who seemed to possess rather narrow feet, and to wear the long-toed boots affected by town boys of the louder sort, had come after her from the car. The marks of his feet were clear, crossing and half obliterating hers. All 3 had stood together for a little, then the tracks moved away, with those of the woman in the middle, and led up to where the mark of a Michelin balloon tire showed clearly. The tires of the Austin were ordinary Dunlops. Besides, this was obviously a bigger car. It had apparently stood there for some little time, for a little pool of engine oil had dripped from the crankcase. Then the bigger car had moved off, down a sort of ride that led away through the trees. Parker followed it for a little distance, but the tracks soon became lost in a thick carpet of pine needles. Still, there was no other road for a car to take. He turned to the Austin to investigate further. Presently, shouts told him that the 2 others were converging upon the centre of the wood. He called back, and before long Wimsey and Sir Charles Pillington came crashing towards him through the bracken which fringed the pines. "Well," said Wimsey, "I imagine we may put down this elegant bit of purple headgear to the gentleman in the slim boots. Bright yellow, I fancy, with buttons. He must be lamenting his beautiful cap. The woman's footprints belong to Mary Whittaker, I take it." "I suppose so. I don't see how they can be the Findlater girls. This woman went or was taken off in the car." "They are certainly not Vera Findlater's. There was no mud on her shoes when we found her." "Oh, you were taking notice, then. I thought you were feeling a bit dead to the world." "So I was, old dear, but I can't help noticin' things, though moribund. Hullo, what's this?" He put his hand down behind the cushions of the car and pulled out an American magazine, that monthly collection of mystery and sensational fiction, published under the name of The Black Mask. "Light reading for the masses," said Parker. "Brought by the gentleman in the yellow boots, perhaps?" suggested the chief constable. "More likely by Miss Findlater," said Wimsey. "Hardly a lady's choice," said Sir Charles, in a pained tone. "Oh, I dunno. From all I hear, Miss Whittaker was dead against sentimentality and roses round the porch, and the other poor girl copied her in everything. They might have a boyish taste in fiction." "Well, it's not important," said Parker. "Wait a bit. Look at this. Somebody's been making marks on it." Wimsey held out the cover for inspection. A thick pencil mark had been drawn under the first 2 words of the title. "Do you think it's some sort of message? Perhaps the book was on the seat, and she contrived to make the marks unnoticed, and shoved it away here before they transferred her to the other car." "Ingenious," said Sir Charles. "But what does it mean? The black. It makes no sense." "Perhaps the long-toed gentleman was a black man," suggested Parker. "Or possibly a Hindu or Parsee of sorts." "God bless my soul!" said Sir Charles, horrified. "An English girl in the hands of a black man! How abominable!" "Well, we'll hope it isn't so. Shall we follow the road out, or wait for the doctor to arrive?" "Better go back to the body, I think," said Parker. "They've got a long start of us, and half an hour more or less in following them up won't make much odds." They turned from the translucent, cool greenness of the little wood back on to the downs. The streamlet clacked merrily away over the pebbles, running out to the southwest on its way to the river and the sea. "It's all very well your chattering," said Wimsey to the water. "Why can't you say what you've seen?" End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. By what means? Death hath so many doors to let out life. Beaumont and Fletcher, Custom of the Country. The doctor turned out to be a plumpish, fussy man, and what Wimsey impatiently called a tutster. He tutted over the mangled head of poor Vera Findlater as though it was an attack of measles after a party, or a self-provoked fit of gout. A terrible blow! How did we come by that, I wonder? Life extinct. Oh, for several days, you know. Which makes it so much more painful, of course. Dear me, how shocking for her poor parents, and her sisters. They are very agreeable girls. You know them, of course, Sir Charles, yes. There is no doubt, I suppose, said Parker, that it is Miss Findlater? None whatever, said Sir Charles. Well, as you can identify her, it may be possible to spare the relatives the shock of seeing her like this. Just a moment, Doctor. The photographer wants to record the position of the body before you move anything. Now, Mr. Andrews? Yes. Have you ever done any photographs of this kind before? No? Well, you mustn't be upset by it. I know it's rather unpleasant. One from here, please, to show the position of the body. Now from the top of the bank. That's right. Now one of the wound itself. A close-up view, please. Yes. Thank you. Now, Doctor, you can turn her over, please. I'm sorry, Mr. Andrews. I know exactly how you're feeling. But these things have to be done. Hullo, look how her arms are all scratched about. Looks as if she'd put up a bit of a fight. The right wrist, left elbow, as though somebody had been trying to hold her down. We must have a photograph of the marks, Mr. Andrews. They may be important. I say, Doctor, what do you make of this on the face? The doctor looked as though he would have preferred not to make so much as an examination of the face. However, with his many tuts, he worked himself up to giving an opinion. As far as one can tell, with all these post-mortem changes, he ventured, it looks as though the face had been roughened or burnt about the nose and lips. Yet there is no appearance of the kind on the bridge of the nose, neck, or forehead. Otherwise I should have put it down to severe sunburn. How about chloroform burns? Suggested Parker. I wish you gentlemen of the police force would not be quite so abrupt. You want everything decided in too great a hurry. I was about to remark, if you had not anticipated me, that since I could not put the appearance down to sunburn, there remains some such possibility as you suggest. I can't possibly say that it is the result of chloroform. Medical pronouncements of that kind cannot be hastily made without cautious investigation. but I was about to remark that it might be." "In that case," put in Wimsey, "could she have died from the effects of chloroform, supposing she was given too much, or that her heart was weak?" "My good sir," said the doctor, deeply offended this time, "look at that blow upon her head, and ask yourself whether it is necessary to suggest any other cause of death. Moreover, if she had died of the chloroform, where would be the necessity for the blow?" "That is exactly what I was wondering," said Wimsey. "I suppose," went on the doctor, "you will hardly dispute my medical knowledge?" "Certainly not," said Wimsey. "But, as you say, it is unwise to make any medical pronouncement without cautious investigation." "And this is not the place for it," put in Parker hastily. "I think we have done all there is to do here. Will you go with the body to the mortuary, Doctor? Mr. Andrews, I shall be obliged if you will come and take a few photographs of some footmarks and so on up in the wood. The light is bad, I'm afraid, but we must do our best." He took Wimsey by the arm. "The man is a fool, of course," he said, "but we can get a second opinion. In the meantime, we had better let it be supposed that we accept the surface explanation of all this." "What is the difficulty?" asked Sir Charles, curiously. "Oh, nothing much," replied Parker. "All the appearances are in favour of the girl's having been attacked by a couple of ruffians, who have carried Miss Whittaker off with a view to ransom, after brutally knocking Miss Findlater on the head when she offered resistance. Probably that is the true explanation. Any minor discrepancies will doubtless clear themselves up in time. We shall know better when we have a proper medical examination." They returned to the wood, where the photographs were taken and careful measurements made of the footprints. The chief constable followed these activities with intense interest, looking over Parker's shoulder as he entered the particulars in his notebook. "I say," he said suddenly, "isn't it rather odd—" "Here's somebody coming," broke in Parker. The sound of a motorcycle being urged in second gear over the rough ground proved to be the herald of a young man armed with a camera. "Oh, God," groaned Parker, "the damned press already." He received the journalist courteously enough, showing him the wheel tracks and the footprints, and outlining the kidnapping theory, as they walked back to the place where the body was found. "Can you give us any idea, Inspector, of the appearance of the two wanted men?" "Well," said Parker, "one of them appears to be something of a dandy. He wears a loathsome mauve cap and narrow pointed shoes, and if those marks on the magazine cover mean anything, one or other of the men may possibly be a coloured man of some kind. Of the second man, all we can definitely say is that he wears number 10 shoes with rubber heels." "I was going to say," said Pillington, "that, apropos de but, it is rather remarkable—" "And this is where we found the body of Miss Findlater," went on Parker ruthlessly. He described the injuries and the position of the body, and the journalist gratefully occupied himself with taking photographs, including a group of Wimsey, Parker, and the chief constable standing among the gorse bushes, while the latter majestically indicated the fatal spot with his walking stick. "And now you've got what you want, old son," said Parker benevolently. "Buzz off, won't you, and tell the rest of the boys. You've got all we can tell you, and we've got other things to do beyond granting special interviews." The reporter asked no better. This was tantamount to making his information exclusive, and no Victorian matron could have a more delicate appreciation of the virtues of exclusiveness than a modern newspaper man. "Well now, Sir Charles," said Parker, when the man had happily chugged and popped himself away, "what were you about to say in the matter of the footprints?" But Sir Charles was offended. The Scotland Yard man had snubbed him and thrown doubt on his discretion. "Nothing," he replied. "I feel sure that my conclusions would appear very elementary to you." And he preserved a dignified silence throughout the return journey. The Whittaker case had begun almost imperceptibly in the overhearing of a casual remark dropped in a Soho restaurant. It ended amid a roar of publicity that shook England from end to end and crowded even Wimbledon into second place. The bare facts of the murder and kidnapping appeared exclusively that night in a late edition of the Evening News. Next morning it sprawled over the Sunday papers with photographs and full details, actual and imaginary. The idea of two English girls, the one brutally killed, the other carried off for some unthinkably sinister end by a black man, aroused all the passion of horror and indignation of which the English temperament is capable. Reporters swarmed down upon Crow's Beach like locusts. The downs near Shellyhead were like a fair, with motors, bicycles, and parties on foot rushing out to spend a happy weekend amid surroundings of mystery and bloodshed. Parker, who with Wimsey had taken rooms at the Grey Lion, sat answering the telephone and receiving the letters and wires which descended upon him from all sides, with a stalwart policeman posted at the end of the passage to keep out all intruders. Wimsey fidgeted about the room, smoking cigarette after cigarette in his excitement. "This time we've got them," he said. "They've overreached themselves, thank God." "Yes, but have a little patience, old man. We can't lose them, but we must have all the facts first." "You're sure those fellows have got Mrs. Forrest safe?" "Oh, yes. She came back to the flat on Monday night, or so the garageman says. Our men are shadowing her continually, and will let us know the moment anybody comes to the flat." "Monday night?" "Yes, but that's no proof in itself. Monday night is quite a usual time for week-enders to return to town. Besides, I don't want to frighten her till we know whether she's the principal or merely the accomplice. Look here, Peter, I've had a message from another of our men. He's been looking into the finances of Miss Whittaker and Mrs. Forrest. Miss Whittaker has been drawing out big sums ever since last December year in cheques to self, and these correspond almost exactly, amount for amount, with sums which Mrs. Forrest has been paying into her own account. The woman has had a big hold over Miss Whittaker ever since Miss Dawson died. She's in it up to her neck, Peter." "I knew it. She's been doing the jobs while the Whittaker woman held down her alibi in Kent. For God's sake, Charles, make no mistake. Nobody's life is safe for a second while either of them is at large." "When a woman is wicked and unscrupulous," said Parker sententiously, "she is the most ruthless criminal in the world. 50 times worse than a man, because she is always so much more single-minded about it." "They're not troubled with sentimentality, that's why," said Wimsey. "And we poor mutts of men stuff ourselves up with the idea that they're romantic and emotional. All punk, my son. Damn that 'phone." Parker snatched up the receiver. "Yes, speaking." "Good God, you don't say so. All right. Yes, of course you must detain him. I think myself it's a plant, but he must be held and questioned. And see that all the papers have it. Tell him you're sure he's the man, see? Soak it well into 'em that that's the official view. And wait a moment. I want photographs of the check and of any fingerprints on it. Send 'em down immediately by special messenger. It's genuine, I suppose? The bank people say it is? Good. What's his story? Oh, any envelope? Destroyed. Silly devil. Right. Goodbye. He turned to Wimsey with some excitement. Hallelujah Dawson walked into Lloyd's Bank in Stepney yesterday morning and presented Mary Whittaker's cheque for £10,000, drawn on their Leahampton branch, to bearer, and dated Friday the 24th. As the sum was such a large one, and the story of the disappearance was in Friday night's paper, they asked him to call again. Meanwhile, they communicated with Leahampton. When the news of the murder came out yesterday evening, the Leahampton manager remembered about it and phoned the Yard, with the result that they sent round this morning and had Hallelujah up for a few inquiries. His story is that the cheque arrived on Saturday morning, all by itself, in an envelope, without a word of explanation. Of course, the old juggins chucked the envelope away, so that we can't verify his tale or get a line on the postmark. Our people thought the whole thing looked a bit fishy, so Hallelujah is detained pending investigation. In other words, arrested for murder and conspiracy. Poor old Hallelujah! Charles, this is simply devilish. That innocent, decent old creature who couldn't harm a fly. I know. Well, he's in for it, and we'll have to go through with it. It's all the better for us. Hell's bells, there's somebody at the door. Come in. It's Dr. Faulkner to see you, sir, said the constable, putting his head in. Oh, good. Come in, doctor. Have you made your examination? I have, Inspector. Very interesting. You were quite right. I'll tell you that much straight away. I'm glad to hear that. Sit down and tell us all about it. I'll be as brief as possible, said the doctor. He was a London man, sent down by Scotland Yard, and accustomed to police work. A lean, grey badger of a man, businesslike, keen-eyed, the direct opposite of the tutster who had annoyed Parker the evening before. Well, first of all, the blow on the head had, of course, nothing whatever to do with the death. You saw that yourself. There was next to no bleeding. The wound was inflicted some time after death, no doubt to create the impression of an attack by a gang. Similarly with the cuts and scratches on the arms. They are the merest camouflage. Exactly. Your colleague, my colleague, as you call him, is a fool, snorted the doctor. If that's a specimen of his diagnosis, I should think there would be a high death rate in Crow's Beach. That's by the way. You want the cause of death? Chloroform? Possibly. I opened the body, but found no special symptoms suggestive of poisoning or anything. I have removed the necessary organs and sent them to Sir James Lubbock for analysis at your suggestion, but candidly I expect nothing from that. There was no odour of chloroform on opening the thorax. Either the time elapsed since death was too long, as is very possible, seeing how volatile the stuff is, or the dose was too small. I found no indications of any heart weakness, so that to produce death in a healthy young girl, chloroform would have had to be administered over a considerable time. Do you think it was administered at all? Yes, I think it was. The burns on the face certainly suggest it. That would also account for the handkerchief found in the car, said Wimsey. I suppose, pursued Parker, that it would require considerable strength and determination to administer chloroform to a strong young woman. She would probably resist strenuously. She would, said the doctor grimly, but the odd thing is, she didn't. As I said before, all the marks of violence were inflicted post-mortem." "Suppose she had been asleep at the time?" suggested Wimsey. "Couldn't it have been done quietly then?" "Oh, yes, easily. After a few long breaths of the stuff she would become semi-conscious, and then could be more firmly dealt with. It is quite possible, I suppose, that she fell asleep in the sunshine while her companion wandered off and was kidnapped, and that the kidnappers then came along and got rid of Miss Findlater." "That seems a little unnecessary," said Parker. "Why come back to her at all?" "Do you suggest that they both fell asleep, and were both set on and chloroformed at the same time? It sounds rather unlikely." Parker outlined the history of their suspicions about Mary Whittaker, to which the doctor listened in horrified amazement. "What happened," said Parker, "as we think, is this. We think that for some reason Miss Whittaker had determined to get rid of this poor girl who was so devoted to her. She arranged that they should go off for a picnic, and that it should be known where they were going to. Then, when Vera Findlater was dozing in the sunshine, our theory is that she murdered her, either with chloroform or, more likely, I fancy, by the same method that she used upon her other victims, whatever that was. Then she struck her on the head and produced the other appearances suggestive of a struggle, and left on the bushes a cap which she had previously purchased and stained with brilliantine. I am, of course, having the cap traced. Miss Whittaker is a tall, powerful woman. I don't think it would be beyond her strength to inflict that blow on an unresisting body. But how about those footmarks in the wood?" "I'm coming to that. There are one or two very odd things about them. To begin with, if this was the work of a secret gang, why should they go out of their way to pick out the one damp, muddy spot in 20 miles of country to leave their footprints in, when almost anywhere else they could have come and gone without leaving any recognizable traces at all?" "Good point," said the doctor. "And I add to that they must have noticed they'd left a cap behind. Why not come back and remove it?" "Exactly. Then again, both pairs of shoes left prints entirely free from the marks left by wear and tear. I mean that there were no signs of the heels or soles being worn at all, while the rubbers on the larger pair were obviously just out of the shop. We shall have the photographs here in a moment, and you will see. Of course, it's not impossible that both men should be wearing brand-new shoes, but, on the whole, it's unlikely." "It is," agreed the doctor. "And now we come to the most suggestive thing of all. One of the supposed men had very much bigger feet than the other, from which you would expect a taller and possibly heavier man with a longer stride. But on measuring the footprints, what do we find? In all three cases, the big man, the little man, and the woman, we have exactly the same length of stride. Not only that, but the footprints have sunk into the ground to precisely the same depth, indicating that all three people were of the same weight. Now, the other discrepancies might pass, but that is absolutely beyond the reach of coincidence." Dr. Faulkner considered this for a moment. "You've proved your point," he said at length. "I consider that absolutely convincing." "It struck even Sir Charles Pilkington, who is none too bright," said Parker. "I had the greatest difficulty in preventing him from blurting out the extraordinary agreement of the measurements to that Evening Views man." "You think, then, that Miss Whittaker had come provided with these shoes and produced the tracks herself?" "Yes, returning each time through the bracken. Cleverly done. She had made no mistake about superimposing the footprints. It was all worked out to a nicety, each set over and under the two others, to produce the impression that 3 people had been there at the same time. Intensive study of the works of Mr. Austin Freeman, I should say. And what next? Well, I think we shall find that this Mrs. Forrest, who we think has been her accomplice all along, had brought her car down, the big car, that is, and was waiting there for her. Possibly she did the making of the footprints while Mary Whittaker was staging the assault. Anyhow, she probably arrived there after Mary Whittaker and Vera Findlater had left the Austin and departed to the Hollow on the Downs. When Mary Whittaker had finished her part of the job, they put the handkerchief and the magazine called The Black Mask into the Austin and drove off in Mrs. Forrest's car. I'm having the movements of the car investigated, naturally. It's a dark blue Renault 4-seater with Michelin balloon tires, and the number is X04247. We know that it returned to Mrs. Forrest's garage on the Monday night with Mrs. Forrest in it. But where is Miss Whittaker? In hiding somewhere. We shall get her all right. She can't get money from her own bank. They're warned. If Mrs. Forrest tries to get money for her, she will be followed. So if the worst comes to the worst, we can starve her out in time, with any luck. But we've got another clue. There has been a most determined attempt to throw suspicion on an unfortunate relative of Miss Whittaker's, a black nonconformist parson with the remarkable name of Hallelujah Dawson. He has certainly pecuniary claims on Miss Whittaker, not legal claims, but claims which any decent and humane person should have respected. She didn't respect them, and the poor old man might very well have been expected to nurse a grudge against her. Yesterday morning he tried to cash a bearer cheque of hers for £10,000 with a lame-sounding story, to the effect that it had arrived by the first post without explanation in an envelope. So, of course, he's had to be detained as one of the kidnappers. But that's very clumsy, surely. He's almost certain to have an alibi. I fancy the story will be that he hired some gangsters to do the job for him. He belongs to a mission in Stepney, where that mauve cap came from, and no doubt there are plenty of tough lads in his neighbourhood. Of course, we shall make close inquiries, and publish details broadcast in all the papers. And then? Well, then, I fancy, the idea is that Miss Whittaker will turn up somewhere in an agitated condition with a story of assault and holding to ransom made to fit the case. If Cousin Hallelujah has not produced a satisfactory alibi, we shall learn that he was on the spot directing the murders. If he has definitely shown that he wasn't there, his name will have been mentioned, or he will have turned up at some time which the poor dear girl couldn't exactly ascertain, in some dreadful den to which she was taken in a place which she won't be able to identify. What a devilish plot! Yes, Miss Whittaker is a charming young woman. If there's anything she'd stop at, I don't know what it is. And the amiable Mrs. Forrest appears to be another of the same kidney. Of course, Doctor, we're taking you into our confidence. You understand that our catching Mary Whittaker depends on her believing that we've swallowed all those false clues of hers. I'm not a talker, said the doctor. Gang you call it, and gang it is, as far as I'm concerned, and Miss Findlater was hit on the head and died of it. I only hope my colleague and the chief constable will be equally discreet. I warned them, naturally, after what you said last night. It's all very well, said Wimsey, but what positive evidence have we, after all, against this woman? A clever defending counsel would tear the whole thing to rags. The only thing we can absolutely prove her to have done is the burgling that house on Hampstead Heath, and stealing the coal. The other deaths were returned as natural deaths at the inquest. And as for Miss Findlater, even if we show it to be chloroform, well, chloroform isn't difficult stuff to get hold of. It's not arsenic or cyanide. And even if there were fingerprints on the spanner, there were not, said Parker gloomily. This girl knows what she's about. What did she want to kill Vera Findlater for, anyway? Asked the doctor suddenly. According to you, the girl was the most valuable bit of evidence she had. She was the one witness who could prove that Miss Whittaker had an alibi for the other crimes, if they were crimes. She may have found out too much about the connection between Miss Whittaker and Mrs. Forrest. My impression is that she had served her turn and become dangerous. What we are hoping to surprise now is some communication between Forrest and Whittaker. Once we've got that... said Dr. Faulkner. He had strolled to the window. I don't want to worry you unduly, but I perceive Sir Charles Pillington in conference with the special correspondent of The Wire. The Yell came out with the gang story all over the front page this morning, and a patriotic leader about the danger of encouraging colored aliens. I needn't remind you that The Wire would be ready to corrupt the Archangel Gabriel in order to kill the Yell's story. Oh, hell, said Parker, rushing to the window. Too late, said the doctor. The Wire man has vanished into the post office. Of course, you can phone up and try to stop it. Parker did so, and was courteously assured by the editor of The Wire that the story had not reached him, and that if it did, he would bear Inspector Parker's instructions in mind. The editor of The Wire was speaking the exact truth. The story had been received by the editor of the Evening Banner, sister paper of The Wire. In times of crisis, it is sometimes convenient that the left hand should not know what the right hand does. After all, it was an exclusive story. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Case of Conscience. I know thou art religious, and hast a thing within thee called conscience, with 20 popish tricks and ceremonies, which I have seen thee carefully to observe. Titus Andronicus. Thursday, June 23rd, was the eve of St. John. The sober green workaday dress in which the church settles down to her daily duties after the bridal raptures of Pentecost had been put away, and the altar was white and shining once again. Vespers were over in the Lady Chapel at St. Onesimus. A faint reek of incense hung cloudily under the dim beams of the roof. A very short acolyte, with a very long brass extinguisher, snuffed out the candles, adding the faintly unpleasant yet sanctified odour of hot wax. The small congregation of elderly ladies rose up lingeringly from their devotions and slipped away in a series of deep genuflections. Miss Climpson gathered up a quantity of little manuals and groped for her gloves. In so doing, she dropped her office book. It fell annoyingly behind the long kneeler, scattering as it went a small Pentecostal shower of Easter cards, bookmarkers, sacred pictures, dried palms, and Ave Marias into the dark corner behind the confessional. Miss Climpson gave a little exclamation of wrath as she dived after them, and immediately repented this improper outburst of anger in a sacred place. "Discipline," she murmured, retrieving the last lost sheep from under a hassock. "Discipline. I must learn self-control." She crammed the papers back into the office book, grasped her gloves and handbag, bowed to the sanctuary, dropped her bag, picked it up, this time in a kind of glow of martyrdom, bustled down the aisle and across the church to the south door, where the sacristan stood, key in hand, waiting to let her out. As she went, she glanced up at the high altar, unlit and lonely, with the tall candles like faint ghosts in the twilight of the apse. It had a grim and awful look, she thought suddenly. "Good night, Mr. Staniforth," she said quickly. "Good night, Miss Climpson. Good night." She was glad to come out of the shadowy porch into the green glow of the June evening. She had felt a menace. Was it the thought of the stern Baptist, with his call to repentance? The prayer for grace to speak the truth and boldly rebuke vice? Miss Climpson decided that she would hurry home and read the Epistle and Gospel, curiously tender and comfortable for the festival of that harsh and uncompromising saint. "And I can tidy up these cards at the same time," she thought. Mrs. Budge's first-floor front seemed stuffy after the scented loveliness of the walk home. Miss Climpson flung the window open and sat down by it to rearrange her sanctified oddments. The card of the Last Supper went in at the prayer of consecration. The Fra Angelico Annunciation had strayed out of the office for March 25th and was wandering among the Sundays after Trinity. The Sacred Heart, with its French text, belonged to the Corpus Christi. "Dear me," said Miss Climpson, "I must have picked this up in church." Certainly the little sheet of paper was not in her writing. Somebody must have dropped it. It was natural to look and see whether it was anything of importance. Miss Climpson was one of those people who say, "I am not the kind of person who reads other people's postcards." This is clear notice to all and sundry that they are precisely that kind of person. They are not untruthful. The delusion is real to them. It is merely that Providence has provided them with a warning rattle, like that of the rattlesnake. After that, if you are so foolish as to leave your correspondence in their way, it is your own affair. Miss Climpson perused the paper. In the manuals for self-examination issued to the Catholic-minded, there is often included an unwise little paragraph which speaks volumes for the innocent unworldliness of the compilers. You are advised, when preparing for confession, to make a little list of your misdeeds, lest one or two peccadillos should slip your mind. It is true that you are cautioned against writing down the names of other people, or showing your list to your friends, or leaving it about. But accidents may happen, and it may be that this recording of sins is contrary to the mind of the Church, who bids you whisper them with fleeting breath into the ear of a priest, and bids him, in the same moment that he absolves, forget them as though they had never been spoken. At any rate, somebody had been recently shriven of the sins set forth upon the paper, probably the previous Saturday, and the document had fluttered down unnoticed between the confession-box and the hassock, escaping the eye of the cleaner. And here it was, the tale that should have been told to none but God, lying open upon Mrs. Budge's round mahogany table under the eye of a fellow mortal. To do Miss Climpson justice, she would probably have destroyed it instantly unread if one sentence had not caught her eye. "The lies I told for M.W.'s sake." At the same moment she realized that this was Vera Findlater's handwriting, and it came over her like a flash, as she explained it afterwards, exactly what the implication of the words was. For a full half-hour Miss Climpson sat alone, struggling with her conscience. Her natural inquisitiveness said, "Read." Her religious training said, "You must not read." Her sense of duty to Wimsey, who employed her, said, "Find out." Her own sense of decency said, "Do no such thing." A dreadful, harsh voice muttered gratingly, "Murder is the question. Are you going to be an accomplice to murder?" She felt like Lancelot Gobbo between conscience and the fiend. But which was the fiend and which was conscience? To speak the truth and boldly rebuke vice. Murder! There was a real possibility now. But was it a possibility? Perhaps she had read into the sentence more than it would bear. In that case, was it not almost a duty to read further and free her mind from this horrible suspicion? She would have liked to go to Mr. Treadgold and ask his advice. Probably he would tell her to burn the paper promptly and drive suspicion out of her mind with prayer and fasting. She got up and began searching for the matchbox. It would be better to get rid of the thing quickly. What exactly was she about to do? To destroy the clue to the discovery of a murder? Whenever she thought of the word, it wrote itself upon her brain in large capitals, heavily underlined. Murder, like a police bill. Then she had an idea. Parker was a policeman, and probably also he had no particular feelings about the sacred secrecy of the confessional. He had a Protestant appearance, or possibly he thought nothing of religion one way or the other. In any case, he would put his professional duty before everything. Why not send him the paper without reading it, briefly explaining how she had come upon it? Then the responsibility would be his. On consideration, however, Miss Climpson's innate honesty scouted this scheme as Jesuitical. Secrecy was violated by this open publication as much as if she had read the thing, or more so. The old Adam, too, raised his head at this point, suggesting that if anybody was going to see the confession, she might just as well satisfy her own reasonable curiosity. Besides, suppose she was quite mistaken. After all, the lies might have nothing to do with Mary Whittaker's alibi. In that case, she would have betrayed another person's secret wantonly and to no purpose. If she did decide to show it, she was bound to read it first, in justice to all parties concerned. Perhaps, if she just glanced at another word or two, she would see that it had nothing to do with murder, and then she could destroy it and forget it. She knew that if she destroyed it unread, she never would forget it to the end of her life. She would always carry with her that grim suspicion. She would think of Mary Whittaker as, perhaps, a murderess. When she looked into those hard blue eyes, she would be wondering what sort of expression they had when the soul behind them was plotting murder. Of course, the suspicions had been there before, planted by Wimsey, but now they were her own suspicions. They crystallized, became real to her. What shall I do? She gave a quick, shamefaced glance at the paper again. This time she saw the word London. Miss Climpson gave a kind of little gasp, like a person stepping under a cold shower bath. "Well," said Miss Climpson, "if this is a sin, I am going to do it, and may I be forgiven." With a red flush creeping over her cheeks, as though she were stripping something naked, she turned her attention to the paper. The jottings were brief and ambiguous. Parker might not have made much of them, but to Miss Climpson, trained in this kind of devotional shorthand, the story was clear as print. Jealousy. The word was written large and underlined. Then there was a reference to a quarrel, to wicked accusations and angry words, and to a preoccupation coming between the penitent's soul and God. Idle, and a long dash. From these few fossil bones, Miss Climpson had little difficulty in reconstructing one of those hateful and passionate scenes of slighted jealousy with which a woman-ridden life had made her only too familiar. "I do everything for you. You don't care a bit for me. You treat me cruelly. You're simply sick of me. That's what it is." And "Don't be so ridiculous. Really, I can't stand this. Oh, stop it, Vera. I hate being slobbered over." Humiliating, degrading, exhausting, beastly scenes. Girls' school, boarding house, Bloomsbury Flat scenes. Damnable selfishness, wearying of its victim. Silly Schwärmerei, swamping all decent self-respect. Barren quarrels ending in shame and hatred. "Beastly, blood-sucking woman," said Miss Climpson viciously. "It's too bad. She's only making use of the girl." But the self-examiner was now troubled with a more difficult problem. Piecing the hints together, Miss Climpson sorted it out with practised ease. Lies had been told. That was wrong, even though done to help a friend. Bad confessions had been made, suppressing those lies. This ought to be confessed and put right. But, the girl asked herself, had she come to this conclusion out of hatred of the lies, or out of spite against the friend? Difficult, this searching of the heart. And ought she, not content with confessing the lies to the priest, also to tell the truth to the world? Miss Climpson had here no doubt what the priest's ruling would be. You need not go out of your way to betray your friend's confidence. Keep silent if you can, but if you speak, you must speak the truth. You must tell your friend that she is not to expect any more lying from you. She is entitled to ask for secrecy, no more. So far so good, but there was a further problem. Ought I to connive at her doing what is wrong? And then a sort of explanatory aside. The man in South Audley Street. This was a little mysterious. No, on the contrary, it explained the whole mystery, jealousy, quarrel, and all. In those weeks of April and May, when Mary Whittaker had been supposed to be all the time in Kent with Vera Findlater, she had been going up to London, and Vera had promised to say that Mary was with her the whole time. And the visits to London had to do with a man in South Audley Street, and there was something sinful about it. That probably meant a love affair. Miss Climpson pursed her lips virtuously, but she was more surprised than shocked. Mary Whittaker? She would never have suspected it of her, somehow. But it so explained the jealousy and the quarrel, the sense of desertion. But how had Vera found out? Had Mary Whittaker confided in her? No. That sentence again, under the heading jealousy. What was it? Following M.W. to London. She had followed, then, and seen. And then, at some moment, she had burst out with her knowledge, reproached her friend. Yet this expedition to London must have happened before her own conversation with Vera Findlater, and the girl had then seemed so sure of Mary's affection. Or had it been that she was trying to persuade herself, with determined self-deception, that there was nothing in this business about the man. Probably. And probably some brutality of Mary's had brought all the miserable suspicions boiling to the surface, vocal, reproachful, and furious. And so they had gone on to the row and the break. Queer, thought Miss Climpson, that Vera has never come and told me about her trouble. But perhaps she is ashamed, poor child. I haven't seen her for nearly a week. I think I'll call and see her, and perhaps she'll tell me all about it. In which case, cried Miss Climpson's conscience, suddenly emerging with a bright and beaming smile from under the buffets of the enemy, in which case I shall know the whole history of it legitimately, and can quite honourably tell Lord Peter about it. The next day, which was Friday, she woke, however, with an unpleasant ache in the conscience. The paper, still tucked into the office book, worried her. She went round early to Vera Findlater's house, only to hear that she was staying with Miss Whittaker. "Then I suppose they've made it up," she said. She did not want to see Mary Whittaker, whether her secret was murder or mere immorality, but she was tormented by the desire to clear up the matter of the alibi for Lord Peter. In Wellington Avenue she was told that the two girls had gone away on the Monday and had not yet returned. She tried to reassure the maid, but her own heart misgave her. Without any real reason, she was uneasy. She went round to the church and said her prayers, but her mind was not on what she was saying. On an impulse, she caught Mr. Treadgold as he pottered in and out of the sacristy, and asked if she might come the next evening to lay a case of conscience before him. So far, so good, and she felt that a good walk might help to clear the cobwebs from her brain. So she started off, missing Lord Peter by a quarter of an hour, and took the train to Guildford, and then walked, and had lunch in a wayside tea shop, and walked back into Guildford, and so came home, where she learnt that Mr. Parker and ever so many gentlemen had been asking for her all day. And what a dreadful thing, miss! Here was Miss Whittaker and Miss Findlater disappeared, and the police out looking for them, and them motor cars was such dangerous things, miss, wasn't they? It was to be hoped there wasn't an accident. And into Miss Climpson's mind there came, like an inspiration, the words, South Audley Street. Miss Climpson did not, of course, know that Wimsey was at Crow's Beach. She hoped to find him in town, for she was seized with a desire, which she could hardly have explained even to herself, to go and look at South Audley Street. What she was supposed to do when she got there she did not know, but go there she must. It was the old reluctance to make open use of that confession paper. Vera Findlater's story at first hand, that was the idea to which she obscurely clung. So she took the first train to Waterloo, leaving behind her, in case Wimsey or Parker should call again, a letter so obscure and mysterious, and so lavishly underlined and interlined, that it was perhaps fortunate for their reason that they were never faced with it. In Piccadilly she saw Bunter, and learned that his lordship was at Crow's Beach with Mr. Parker, where he, Bunter, was just off to join him. Miss Climpson promptly charged him with a message to his employer, slightly more involved and mysterious than her letter, and departed for South Audley Street. It was only when she was walking up it that she realized how vague her quest was, and how little investigation one can do by merely walking along a street. Also, it suddenly occurred to her that if Miss Whittaker was carrying on anything of a secret nature in South Audley Street, the sight of an acquaintance patrolling the pavement would put her on her guard. Much struck by this reflection, Miss Climpson plunged abruptly into a chemist's shop and bought a toothbrush by way of concealing her movements and gaining time. One can while away many minutes comparing the shapes, sizes, and bristles of toothbrushes, and sometimes chemists will be nice and gossipy. Looking round the shop for inspiration, Miss Climpson observed a tin of nasal snuff labelled with the chemist's own name. "I will take a tin of that too, please," she said. "What excellent stuff it is! Quite wonderful! I have used it for years, and I am really delighted with it. I recommend it to all my friends, particularly for hay fever. In fact, there's a friend of mine who often passes your shop who told me only yesterday what a martyr she was to that complaint. 'My dear,' I said to her, 'you have only to get a tin of this splendid stuff, and you will be quite all right all summer.' She was so grateful to me for telling her about it. Has she been in for it yet?" And she described Mary Whittaker closely. It will be noticed, by the way, that in the struggle between Miss Climpson's conscience and what Wilkie Collins calls detective fever, conscience was getting the worst of it, and was winking at an amount of deliberate untruth which a little time earlier would have staggered it. The chemist, however, had seen nothing of Miss Climpson's friend. Nothing, therefore, was to be done but to retire from the field and think what was to be done next. Miss Climpson left, but before leaving she neatly dropped her latchkey into a large basket full of sponges standing at her elbow. She felt she might like to have an excuse to visit South Audley Street again. Conscience sighed deeply, and her guardian angel dropped a tear among the sponges. Retiring into the nearest tea shop she came to, Miss Climpson ordered a cup of coffee and started to think out a plan for honeycombing South Audley Street. She needed an excuse and a disguise. An adventurous spirit was welling up in her elderly bosom, and her first dozen or so ideas were more lurid than practical. At length a really brilliant notion occurred to her. She did not attempt to hide it from herself, precisely the type and build of person one associates with the collection of subscriptions. Moreover, she had a perfectly good and genuine cause ready to hand. The church which she attended in London ran a slum mission which was badly in need of funds, and she possessed a number of collecting cards bearing full authority to receive subscriptions on its behalf. What more natural than that she should try a little house-to-house visiting in a wealthy quarter? The question of disguise also was less formidable than it might appear. Miss Whittaker had only known her well-dressed and affluent in appearance. Ugly, clumping shoes, a hat of virtuous ugliness, a shapeless coat, and a pair of tinted glasses would disguise her sufficiently at a distance. At close quarters it would not matter if she was recognized, for if once she got to close quarters with Mary Whittaker, her job was done, and she had found the house she wanted. Miss Climpson rose from the table, paid her bill, and hurried out to buy the glasses, remembering that it was Saturday. Having secured a pair which hid her eyes effectively without looking exaggeratedly mysterious, she made for her rooms in St. George's Square, to choose suitable clothing for her adventure. She realized, of course, that she could hardly start work till Monday, Saturday afternoon and Sunday are hopeless from the collector's point of view. The choice of clothes and accessories occupied her for the better part of the afternoon. When she was at last satisfied, she went downstairs to ask her landlady for some tea. "Certainly, miss," said the good woman. "Ain't it awful, miss, about this murder?" "What murder?" asked Miss Climpson vaguely. She took the Evening Views from her landlady's hand and read the story of Vera Findlater's death. Sunday was the most awful day Miss Climpson had ever spent. An active woman, she was condemned to inactivity, and she had time to brood over the tragedy. Not having Wimsey's or Parker's inside knowledge, she took the kidnapping story at its face value. In a sense, she found it comforting, for she was able to acquit Mary Whittaker of any share in this or the previous murders. She put them down, except, of course, in the case of Miss Dawson, and that might never have been a murder after all, to the mysterious man in South Audley Street. She formed a nightmare image of him in her mind, blood-boltered, sinister, and, most horrible of all, an associate and employer of debauched and brutal assassins. To Miss Climpson's credit be it said that she never for one moment faltered in her determination to track the monster to his lurking-place. She wrote a long letter to Lord Peter, detailing her plans. Bunter, she knew, had left 110A Piccadilly, so, after considerable thought, she addressed it to Lord Peter Wimsey, C.O., Inspector Parker, the police station, Crow's Beach. There was, of course, no Sunday post from town. However, it would go with the midnight collection. On the Monday morning, she set out early, in her old clothes and her spectacles, for South Audley Street. Never had her natural inquisitiveness and her hard training in third-rate boarding-houses stood her in better stead. She had learned to ask questions without heeding rebuffs, to be persistent, insensitive, and observant. In every flat she visited, she acted her natural self with so much sincerity and such limpet-like obstinacy that she seldom came away without a subscription, and almost never without some information about the flat and its inmates. By tea-time she had done one side of the street and nearly half the other, without result. She was just thinking of going to get some food when she caught sight of a woman about 100 yards ahead, walking briskly in the same direction as herself. Now, it is easy to be mistaken in faces, but almost impossible not to recognize a back. Miss Climpson's heart gave a bound. "Mary Whittaker," she said to herself, and started to follow. The woman stopped to look into a shop window. Miss Climpson hesitated to come closer. If Mary Whittaker was at large, then the kidnapping had been done with her own consent. Puzzled, Miss Climpson determined to play a waiting game. The woman went into the shop. The friendly chemist's was almost opposite. Miss Climpson decided that this was the moment to reclaim her latchkey. She went in and asked for it. It had been put aside for her, and the assistant produced it at once. The woman was still in the shop over the way. Miss Climpson embarked upon a long string of apologies and circumstantial details about her carelessness. The woman came out. Miss Climpson gave her a longish start, brought the conversation to a close, and fussed out again, replacing the glasses, which she had removed for the chemist's benefit. The woman walked on without stopping, but she looked into the shop windows from time to time. A man with a fruiterer's barrow removed his cap as she passed, and scratched his head. Almost at once the woman turned quickly and came back. The fruiterer picked up the handles of his barrow and trundled it away into a side street. The woman came straight on, and Miss Climpson was obliged to dive into a doorway and pretend to be tying a bootlace to avoid a face-to-face encounter. Apparently, the woman had only forgotten to buy cigarettes. She went into a tobacconist's and emerged again in a minute or two, passing Miss Climpson again. That lady had dropped her bag and was agitatedly sorting its contents. The woman passed her without a glance and went on. Miss Climpson, flushed from stooping, followed again. The woman turned in at the entrance to a block of flats next door to a florist's. Miss Climpson was hard on her heels now, for she was afraid of losing her. Mary Whittaker, if it was Mary Whittaker, went straight through the hall to the lift, which was one of the kind worked by the passenger. She stepped in and shot up. Miss Climpson, gazing at the orchids and roses in the florist's window, watched the lift out of sight. Then, with her subscription card prominently in her hand, she too entered the flats. There was a porter on duty in a little glass case. He at once spotted Miss Climpson as a stranger, and asked politely if he could do anything for her. Miss Climpson, selecting a name at random from the list of occupants in the entrance, asked which was Mrs. Forrest's flat. The man replied that it was on the 4th floor, and stepped forward to bring the lift down for her. A man, to whom he had been chatting, moved quietly from the glass case and took up a position in the doorway. As the lift ascended, Miss Climpson noticed that the fruiterer had returned. His barrow now just stood outside. The porter had come up with her and pointed out the door of Mrs. Forrest's flat. His presence was reassuring. She wished he would stay within call till she had concluded her search of the building. However, having asked for Mrs. Forrest, she must begin there. She pressed the bell. At first, she thought the flat was empty, but after ringing a second time, she heard footsteps. The door opened, and a heavily overdressed and peroxided lady made her appearance, whom Lord Peter would at once and embarrassingly have recognized. "I have come," said Miss Climpson, wedging herself briskly in at the doorway with the skill of the practised canvasser, "to try if I can enlist your help for our mission settlement. May I come in? I am sure you—" "No, thanks," said Mrs. Forrest shortly, and in a hurried, breathless tone, as if there was somebody behind her who she was anxious should not overhear her. "I'm not interested in missions." She tried to shut the door, but Miss Climpson had seen and heard enough. "Good gracious!" she cried, staring. "Why, it's—" "Come in." Mrs. Forrest caught her by the arm, almost roughly, and pulled her over the threshold, slamming the door behind them. "How extraordinary!" said Miss Climpson. "I hardly recognized you, Miss Whittaker, with your hair like that." "You," said Mary Whittaker. "You, of all people." They sat facing one another in the sitting-room, with its tawdry pink silk cushions. "I knew you were a meddler. How did you get here? Is there anyone with you?" "No, yes, I just happened—" began Miss Climpson vaguely. One thought was uppermost in her mind. "How did you get free? What happened? Who killed Vera?" She knew she was asking her questions crudely and stupidly. "Why are you disguised like that?" "Who sent you?" reiterated Mary Whittaker. "Who is the man with you?" pursued Miss Climpson. "Is he here? Did he do the murder?" "What man?" "The man Vera saw leaving your flat." Did he? So that's it. Vera told you. The liar. I thought I had been quick enough. Suddenly, something which had been troubling Miss Climpson for weeks crystallized and became plain to her. The expression in Mary Whittaker's eyes. A long time ago, Miss Climpson had assisted a relative to run a boarding house, and there had been a young man who paid his bill by cheque. She had had to make a certain amount of unpleasantness about the bill, and he had written the cheque unwillingly, sitting, with her eye upon him, at the little plush-covered table in the drawing-room. Then he had gone away, slinking out with his bag when no one was about. And the cheque had come back like the bad penny that it was. A forgery. Miss Climpson had had to give evidence. She remembered now the odd, defiant look with which the young man had taken up his pen for his first plunge into crime. And to-day she was seeing it again, an unattractive mingling of recklessness and calculation. It was the look which had once warned Wimsey, and should have warned her. She breathed more quickly. Who was the man? The man? Mary Whittaker laughed suddenly. A man called Templeton. No friend of mine. It's really funny that you should think he was a friend of mine. I would have killed him if I could. But where is he? What are you doing? Don't you know that everybody is looking for you? Why don't you? That's why. Mary Whittaker flung her the 10 o'clock edition of the Evening Banner, which was lying on the sofa. Miss Climpson read the glaring headlines. Amazing new developments in Crow's Beach crime. Wounds on body inflicted after death. Faked footprints. Miss Climpson gasped with amazement and bent over the smaller type. How extraordinary, she said, looking up quickly. Not quite quickly enough. The heavy brass lamp missed her head indeed, but fell numbingly on her shoulder. She sprang to her feet with a loud shriek, just as Mary Whittaker's strong white hands closed upon her throat. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. And smote him thus. 'Tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough, 'twill serve. Romeo and Juliet. Lord Peter missed both Miss Climpson's communications. Absorbed in the police inquiry, he never thought to go back to Leahampton. Bunter had duly arrived with Mrs. Myrtle on the Saturday evening. Immense police activity was displayed in the neighbourhood of the Downs, and at Southampton and Portsmouth, in order to foster the idea that the authorities supposed the gang to be lurking in those districts. Nothing, as a matter of fact, was farther from Parker's thoughts. Wimsey fretted. He wanted the analysis of the body to be complete, and loathed the thought of the long days he had to wait, and he had small hope of the result. It's all very well sitting round with your large disguised policemen outside Mrs. Forrest's flat, he said irritably over the bacon and eggs on Monday morning. But you do realize, don't you, that we've still got no proof of murder, not in one single case? That's so, replied Parker placidly. Well, doesn't it make your blood boil? Said Wimsey. Hardly, said Parker. This kind of thing happens too often. If my blood boiled every time there was a delay in getting evidence, I should be in a perpetual fever. Why worry? It may be that perfect crime you're so fond of talking about, the one that leaves no trace. You ought to be charmed with it." "Oh, I dare say. Oh, turpitude, where are the charms that sages have seen in thy face? Time's called at the criminal's arms, and there isn't a drink in the place. Wimsey's standard poets, with emendations by Thingamummy. As a matter of fact, I'm not at all sure that Miss Dawson's death wasn't the perfect crime, if only the Whittaker girl had stopped at that, and not tried to cover it up. If you notice, the deaths are becoming more and more violent, elaborate, and unlikely in appearance. Telephone again. If the post office accounts don't show a handsome profit on telephones this year, it won't be your fault." "It's the cap and shoes," said Parker mildly. "They've traced them. They were ordered from an outfitter's in Stepney to be sent to the Reverend H. Dawson, Peveril Hotel, Bloomsbury, to await arrival." "The Peveril again?" "Yes. I recognize the hand of Mr. Trigg's mysterious charmer. The Reverend Hallelujah Dawson's card, with message 'Please give parcel to bearer,' was presented by a district messenger next day, with a verbal explanation that the gentleman found he could not get up to town after all. The messenger, obeying instructions received by telephone, took the parcel to a lady in a nurse's dress on the platform at Charing Cross. Asked to describe the lady, he said she was tall, and wore blue glasses and the usual cloak and bonnet. So that's that." "How were the goods paid for?" "Postal order purchased at the West Central office at the busiest moment of the day." "And when did all this happen?" "That's the most interesting part of the business. Last month, shortly before Miss Whittaker and Miss Findlater returned from Kent. This plot was well thought out beforehand." "Yes. Well, that's something more for you to pin onto Mrs. Forrest. It looks like proof of conspiracy, but whether it's proof of murder—" "It's meant to look like conspiracy of Cousin Hallelujah's, I suppose. Oh, well, we shall have to trace the letters and the typewriter that wrote them, and interrogate all these people, I suppose. God, what a grind! Hullo, come in. Oh, it's you, Doctor." "Excuse my interrupting your breakfast," said Dr. Faulkner, "but early this morning, while lying awake, I was visited with a bright idea. So I had to come and work it off on you while it was still fresh. About the blow on the head and the marks on the arms, you know. Do you suppose they served a double purpose? Besides making it look like the work of a gang, could they be hiding some other smaller mark? Poison, for instance, could be injected, and the mark covered up by scratches and cuts inflicted after death." "Frankly," said Parker, "I wish I could think it. It's a very sound idea, and may be the right one. Our trouble is that in the two previous deaths, which we have been investigating, and which we are inclined to think form a part of the same series as this one, there have been no signs or traces of poison discoverable in the bodies at all by any examination or analysis that skill can devise. In fact, not only no proof of poison, but no proof of anything but natural death." And he related the cases in fuller detail. "Odd," said the doctor. "And you think this may turn out the same way? Still, in this case, the death can't very well have been natural, or why these elaborate efforts to cover it up?" "It wasn't," said Parker. "The proof being that, as we know, the plot was laid nearly 2 months ago." "But the method!" cried Wimsey. "The method! Hang it all! Here are all we people with our brilliant brains and our professional reputations, And this half-trained girl out of a hospital can beat the lot of us. How was it done?" "It's probably something so simple and obvious that it's never occurred to us," said Parker. "The sort of principle you learn when you're in the fourth form and never apply to anything. Rudimentary. Like that motorcycling imbecile we met up at Crofton, who sat in the rain and prayed for help because he'd never heard of an airlock in his feed. Now, I dare say that boy had learnt. What's the matter with you?" "My God!" cried Wimsey. He smashed his hand down among the breakfast things, upsetting his cup. "My God, but that's it! You've got it! You've done it! Obvious! God Almighty, it doesn't need a doctor. A garage hand could have told you. People die of it every day. Of course it was an airlock in the feed." "Bear up, doctor," said Parker. "He's always like this when he gets an idea. It wears off in time. Do you mind explaining yourself, old thing?" Wimsey's pallid face was flushed. He turned on the doctor. "Look here," he said. "The body is a pumping engine, isn't it? The jolly old heart pumps the blood round the arteries and back through the veins and so on, doesn't it? That's what keeps things working, what? Round and home again in 2 minutes, that sort of thing." "Certainly." "Little valve to let the blood out, 'nother little valve to let it in, just like an internal combustion engine, which it is." "Of course." "And supposin' that stops?" "You die." "Yes. Now look here. Supposin' you take a good big hypodermic, empty, and dig it into one of the big arteries and push the handle. What would happen?" "What would happen, doctor? You'd be pumping a big air bubble into your engine feed, wouldn't you? What would become of your circulation then?" "It would stop it," said the doctor without hesitation. "That is why nurses have to be particular to fill the syringe properly, especially when doing an intravenous injection." "I knew it was the kind of thing you learnt in the fourth form. Well, go on. Your circulation would stop. It would be like an embolism in its effect, wouldn't it?" "Only if it was in the main artery, of course. In a small vein the blood would find a way round. That is why—" this seemed to be the doctor's favourite opening— "that is why it is so important that embolisms, blood clots, should be dispersed as soon as possible and not left to wander about the system." "Yes, yes, but the air bubble, doctor, in a main artery, say the femoral or the big vein in the bend of the elbow, that would stop the circulation, wouldn't it? How soon?" "Why, at once. The heart would stop beating." "And then?" "You would die." "With what symptoms?" "None to speak of. Just a gasp or two. The lungs would make a desperate effort to keep things going. Then you'd just stop, like heart failure. It would be heart failure." "How well I know it! That sneeze in the carburetor, a gasping, as you say. And what would be the post-mortem symptoms?" "None. Just the appearances of heart failure. And, of course, the little mark of the needle, if you happened to be looking for it." "You're sure of all this, doctor?" said Parker. "Well, it's simple, isn't it? A plain problem in mechanics. Of course that would happen. It must happen." "Could it be proved?" insisted Parker. "That's more difficult." "We must try," said Parker. "It's ingenious, and it explains a lot of things. Doctor, will you go down to the mortuary again and see if you can find any puncture mark on the body? I really think you've got the explanation of the whole thing, Peter. Oh dear, who's on the phone now? What? What? Oh, hell! Well, that's torn it. She'll never come back now. Worn all the ports. Send out an all-stations call. Watch the railways, and go through Bloomsbury with a tooth-comb. That's the part she knows best. I'm coming straight up to town now. Yes, immediately. Right you are." He hung up the receiver with a few brief, choice expressions. That adjectival imbecile, Pillington, has let out all he knows. The whole story is in the early editions of the Banner. We're doing no good here. Mary Whittaker will know the game's up, and she'll be out of the country in 2 if she isn't already. Coming back to town, Wimsey? Naturally. Take you up in the car. Lose no time. Ring the bell for Bunter, would you? Oh, Bunter, we're going up to town. How soon can we start? At once, my lord. I have been holding your lordship's and Mr. Parker's things ready packed from hour to hour, in case a hurried adjournment should be necessary. Good man. And there is a letter for you, Mr. Parker, sir. Oh, thanks. Ah, yes. The fingerprints off the cheque. 2 sets only, besides those of the cashier, of course. Cousin Hallelujah's and a female set. Presumably those of Mary Whittaker. Yes, obviously, here are the forefingers of the left hand, just as one would place them to hold the cheque flat while signing. Pardon me, sir, but might I look at that photograph? Certainly. Take a copy for yourself. I know it interests you as a photographer. Well, cheerio, Doctor. See you in town sometime. Come on, Peter. Lord Peter came on, and that, as Dr. Faulkner would say, was why Miss Climpson's second letter was brought up from the police station too late to catch him. They reached town at 12, owing to Wimsey's brisk work at the wheel, and went straight to Scotland Yard, dropping Bunter at his own request, as he was anxious to return to the flat. They found the Chief Commissioner in rather a brusque mood, angry with the Banner, and annoyed with Parker for having failed to muzzle Pillington. God knows where she'll be found next. She's probably got a disguise and a getaway already. Probably gone already, said Wimsey. She could easily have left England on the Monday or Tuesday, and nobody a penny the wiser. If the coast had seemed clear, she'd have come back and taken possession of her goods again. Now she'll stay abroad, that's all. I'm very much afraid you're right, agreed Parker gloomily. Meanwhile, what is Mrs. Forrest doing? Behaving quite normally. She's been carefully shadowed, of course, but not interfered with in any way. We've got 3 men out there now, one as a coster, one as a dear friend of the hall porter's who drops in every so often with racing tips, and an odd job man doing a spot of work in the backyard. They report that she has been in and out, shopping and so on, but mostly having her meals at home. No one has called. The men deputed to shadow her away from the flat have watched carefully to see if she speaks to anyone or slips money to anyone. We're pretty sure that the 2 haven't met yet. Excuse me, sir. An officer put his head in at the door. Here's Lord Peter Wimsey's man, sir, with an urgent message. Bunter entered, trimly correct in bearing, but with a glitter in his eye. He laid down 2 photographs on the table. Excuse me, my lord and gentlemen, but would you be so good as to cast your eyes on these 2 photographs? Fingerprints, said the chief interrogatively. One of them is our own official photograph of the prints on the $10,000 cheque, said Parker. The other, where did you get this, Bunter? It looks like the same set of prints, but it's not one of ours. They appeared similar, sir, to my uninstructed eye. I thought it better to place the matter before you. Send Dewsby here, said the Chief Commissioner. Dewsby was the head of the fingerprint department, and he had no hesitation at all. "They are undoubtedly the same prints," he said. A light was slowly breaking in on Wimsey. "Bunter, did these come off that wine-glass?" "Yes, my lord." "But they are Miss Forrest's." "So I understood you to say, my lord, and I have filed them under that name." "Then if the signature on the cheque is genuine—" "We haven't far to look for our bird," said Parker brutally. "A double identity. Damn the woman! She's made us waste a lot of time. Well, I think we shall get her now, on the Findlater murder at least, and possibly on the go-to-bed business." "But I understood there was an alibi for that," said the chief. "There was," said Parker grimly, "but the witness was the girl that's just been murdered. Looks as though she'd made up her mind to split and was got rid of." "Looks as though several people had had a near squeak of it," said Wimsey. "Including you. That yellow hair was a wig, then." "Probably. It never looked natural, you know. When I was there that night, she had on one of those close turban affairs. She might have been bald, for all one could see." "Did you notice the scar on the fingers of the right hand?" "I did not, for the very good reason that her fingers were stiff with rings to the knuckles. There was pretty good sense behind her ugly bad taste. I suppose I was to be drugged, or, failing that, caressed into slumber, and then, shall we say, put out of circulation. Highly distressing incident. Amorous clubman dies in a flat. Relations very anxious to hush matter up. I was selected, I suppose, because I was seen with Evelyn Cropper at Liverpool. Bertha Go-to-Bed got the same sort of dose too, I take it. Met by old employer accidentally on leaving work. £5 note, a nice little dinner. Lashings of champagne. Poor kid as drunk as a blind fiddler. Bundled into the car, finished off there, and trundled out to Epping, in company with a ham sandwich and a bottle of Bass. Easy, ain't it, when you know how?" "That being so," said the Chief Commissioner, "the sooner we get hold of her the better. You'd better go at once, Inspector. Take a warrant for Whittaker or Forrest, and any help you may require." "May I come?" asked Wimsey, when they were outside the building. "Why not? You may be useful. With the men we've got there already, we shan't need any extra help." The car whizzed swiftly through Pall Mall, up St. James's Street, and along Piccadilly. Halfway up South Audley Street, they passed the fruit seller, with whom Parker exchanged an almost imperceptible signal. A few doors below the entrance to the flats they got out, and were almost immediately joined by the hall porter's sporting friend. "I was just going to call you up," said the latter. "She's arrived." "What, the Whittaker woman?" "Yes. Went up about 2 minutes ago." "Is Forrest there too?" "Yes. She came in just before the other woman." "Queer," said Parker. "Another good theory gone west. Are you sure it's Whittaker?" "Well, she's made up with old-fashioned clothes and greyish hair and so on. But she's the right height and general appearance. And she's running the old blue spectacle stunt again. I think it's the right one. Though, of course, I didn't get close to her, remembering your instructions." "Well, we'll have a look, anyhow. Come along." The coster had joined them now, and they all entered together. "Did the old girl go up to Forrest's flat all right?" asked the third detective of the porter. "That's right. Went straight to the door and started something about a subscription. Then Mrs. Forrest pulled her in quick and slammed the door. Nobody's come down since." "Right. We'll take ourselves up. And mind you don't let anybody give us the slip by the staircase. Now then, Wimsey, she knows you as Templeton, but she may still not know for certain that you're working with us. Ring the bell, and when the door's open, stick your foot inside. We'll stand just round the corner here and be ready to rush." This manoeuvre was executed. They heard the bell trill loudly. Nobody came to answer it, however. Wimsey rang again, and then bent his ear to the door. "Charles," he cried suddenly, "there's something going on here." His face was white. "Be quick. I couldn't stand another—" Parker hastened up and listened. Then he caught Peter's stick and hammered on the door so that the hollow lift-shaft echoed with the clamour. "Come on there. Open the door. This is the police." And all the time a horrid, stealthy thumping and gurgling sound inside, dragging of something heavy and a scuffling noise, then a loud crash, as though a piece of furniture had been flung to the floor, and then a loud, hoarse scream, cut brutally off in the middle. "Break in the door," said Wimsey, the sweat pouring down his face. Parker signalled to the heavier of the two policemen. He came along, shoulder first, lunging. The door shook and cracked. They stamped and panted in the narrow space. The door gave way, and they tumbled into the hall. Everything was ominously quiet. "Oh, quick!" sobbed Peter. A door on the right stood open. A glance assured them that there was nothing there. They sprang to the sitting-room door and pushed it. It opened about a foot. Something bulky impeded its progress. They shoved violently, and the obstacle gave. Wimsey leapt over it. It was a tall cabinet, fallen, with broken china strewing the floor. The room bore signs of a violent struggle: tables flung down, a broken chair, a smashed lamp. He dashed for the bedroom, with Parker hard at his heels. The body of a woman lay limply on the bed. Her long grizzled hair hung in a dark rope over the pillow, and blood was on her head and throat. But the blood was running freely, and Wimsey could have shouted for joy at the sight. Dead men do not bleed. Parker gave only one glance at the injured woman. He made promptly for the dressing-room beyond. A shot sang past his head. There was a snarl and a shriek, and the episode was over. The constable stood shaking his bitten hand, while Parker put the come-along-o-me grip on the quarry. He recognized her readily, though the peroxide wig had fallen awry, and the blue eyes were bleared with terror and fury. "That'll do," said Parker quietly. "The game's up. It's not a bit of use. Come, be reasonable. You don't want us to put the bracelets on, do you? Mary Whittaker, alias Forrest, I arrest you on the charge—" He hesitated for a moment, and she saw it. "On what charge? What have you got against me?" "Of attempting to murder this lady, for a start," said Parker. "The old fool," she said contemptuously. "She forced her way in here and attacked me. Is that all?" "Very probably not," said Parker. "I warn you that anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence at your trial." Indeed, the third officer had already produced a notebook and was imperturbably writing down. When told the charge, the prisoner said, "Is that all?" The remark evidently struck him as an injudicious one, for he licked his pencil with an air of satisfaction. "Is the lady all right? Who is it?" asked Parker, coming back to a survey of the situation. "It's Miss Climpson. God knows how she got here. I think she's all right, but she's had a rough time." He was anxiously sponging her head, and at that moment her eyes opened. "Help!" said Miss Climpson confusedly. "The syringe. You shan't. Oh!" She struggled feebly, and then recognized Wimsey's anxious face. "Oh, dear!" she exclaimed. Lord Peter, such an upset! Did you get my letter? Is it all right? Oh dear, what a state I'm in! That woman... Now don't worry, Miss Climpson. Everything's quite all right, and you mustn't talk. You must tell us about it later. What was that about a syringe? Said Parker, intent on his case. She'd got a syringe in her hand, panted Miss Climpson, trying to sit up and fumbling with her hands over the bed. I fainted, I think. Such a struggle, and something hit me on the head. And I saw her coming at me with the thing, and I knocked it out of her hand, and I can't remember what happened afterwards. But I have remarkable vitality, said Miss Climpson cheerfully. My dear father always used to say Climpsons take a lot of killing. Parker was groping on the floor. Here you are, said he. In his hand was a hypodermic syringe. She's mental, that's what she is, said the prisoner. That's only the hypodermic I use for my injections when I get neuralgia. There's nothing in that. That is quite correct, said Parker, with a significant nod at Wimsey. There is nothing in it. On the Tuesday night, when the prisoner had been committed for trial on the charges of murdering Bertha Gotobed and Vera Findlater, and attempting to murder Alexandra Climpson, Wimsey dined with Parker. The former was depressed and nervous. The whole thing's been beastly, he grumbled. They had sat up discussing the case into the small hours. Interesting, said Parker. Interesting. I owe you 7 and 6, by the way. We ought to have seen through that forest business earlier. But there seemed no real reason to suspect the Findlater girl's word as to the alibi. These mistaken loyalties make a lot of trouble. I think the thing that put us off was that it all started so early. There seemed no reason for it. But looking back on Trigg's story, it's as plain as a pikestaff. She took a big risk with that empty house, and she couldn't always expect to find empty houses handy to do away with people in. The idea was, I suppose, to build up a double identity, so that if Mary Whittaker was ever suspected of anything, she could quickly disappear and become the frail but otherwise innocent Mrs. Forrest. The real slip-up was forgetting to take back that £5 note from Bertha Gotobed. If it hadn't been for that, we might never have known anything about Mrs. Forrest. It must have rattled her horribly when we turned up there. After that, she was known to the police in both her characters. The Findlater business was a desperate attempt to cover up her tracks, and it was bound to fail because it was so complicated. Yes, but the Dawson murder was beautiful in its ease and simplicity. If she had stuck to that and left well alone, we could never have proved anything. We can't prove it now, which is why I left it off the charge sheet. I don't think I've ever met a more greedy and heartless murderer. She probably really thought that anyone who inconvenienced her had no right to exist. Greedy and malicious. Fancy trying to shove the blame on poor old Hallelujah. I suppose he'd committed the unforgivable sin of asking her for money. Well, he'll get it. That's one good thing. The pit digged for Cousin Hallelujah has turned into a gold mine. That £10,000 cheque has been honoured. I saw to that first thing, before Whittaker could remember to try and stop it. Probably she couldn't have stopped it anyway, as it was duly presented last Saturday. Is the money legally hers? Of course it is. We know it was gained by a crime, but we haven't charged her with the crime, so that legally no such crime was committed. I've not said anything to Cousin Hallelujah, of course. or he mightn't like to take it. He thinks it was sent him in a burst of contrition, poor old dear. So Cousin Hallelujah and all the little Hallelujahs will be rich. That's splendid. How about the rest of the money? Will the Crown get it, after all? No, unless she wills it to someone. It will go to the Whittaker next of kin, a first cousin, I believe, called Alcock, a very decent fellow, living in Birmingham. That is, he added, assailed by sudden doubt, if first cousins do inherit under this confounded Act. "Oh, I think first cousins are safe," said Wimsey, "though nothing seems safe nowadays. Still, dash it all, some relations must still be allowed a look in, or what becomes of the sanctity of family life? If so, that's the most cheering thing about the beastly business. Do you know, when I rang up that man Carr and told him all about it, he wasn't a bit interested or grateful. Said he'd always suspected something like that, and he hoped we weren't going to rake it all up again, because he'd come into that money he told us about, and was setting up for himself in Harley Street. So he didn't want any more scandals. I never did like that man. I'm sorry for Nurse Philliter." "You needn't be. I put my foot in it again over that. Carr's too grand to marry a nurse now. At least I fancy that's what it is. Anyway, the engagement's off. And I was so pleased at the idea of playing Providence to two deserving young people," added Wimsey pathetically. "Dear, dear. Well, the girl's well out of it. Hullo, there's the phone. Who on earth? Some damn thing at the Yard, I suppose. At 3 Ac. Emma. Who'd be a policeman? Yes? Oh, right, I'll come right round. The case has gone west, Peter." "How?" "Suicide. Strangled herself with a sheet. I'd better go round, I suppose." "I'll come with you." "An evil woman, if ever there was one," said Parker softly, as they looked at the rigid body with its swollen face and the deeper red ring about the throat. Wimsey said nothing. He felt cold and sick. While Parker and the governor of the prison made the necessary arrangements and discussed the case, he sat hunched unhappily upon his chair. Their voices went on and on interminably. 6 o'clock had struck some time before they rose to go. It reminded him of the 8 strokes of the clock which announced the running up of the black and hideous flag. As the gate clanged open to let them out, they stepped into a wan and awful darkness. The June day had risen long ago, but only a pale and yellowish gleam lit the half-deserted streets, and it was bitterly cold and raining. "What is the matter with the day?" said Wimsey. "Is the world coming to an end?" "No," said Parker. "It is the eclipse." End of chapter 23. End of Unnatural Death by Dorothy Sayers. Recording by Kirsten Wever.